Pressure did not bend him, it revealed him. While others hesitated, recalculated, or waited for perfect conditions, Georgy Zhukov was sent to places where collapse already felt inevitable. He did not arrive to inspire with speeches or promises. He arrived to stop defeat, immediately, brutally, and at any cost the moment demanded. Zhukov was not shaped by comfort or theory. He was shaped by crisis. Again and again, when the Soviet Union stood on the edge, when fronts were breaking, when cities were about to fall, when armies were close to annihilation, it was Zhukov who was dispatched. Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin. Each time, the situation was already desperate. Each time, expectations were simple and unforgiving. Hold, counterattack, or lose everything. He believed war was decided by reality, not optimism. If manpower was required, it was used. If ground had to be traded, it was calculated. If an enemy had to be crushed, it was done without illusion. Zhukov understood scale better than most. He understood that modern war consumed resources faster than emotion could keep up. He planned not for elegance, but for inevitability, building pressure until resistance collapsed under its own weight. At Moscow, he organized defense where retreat seemed unavoidable. At Stalingrad, he helped design encirclement instead of relief. At Kursk, he chose to absorb the blow, then break the attacker completely. These were not gambles. They were calculated confrontations with reality. Zhukov did not chase glory. Glory followed consequence. His relationship with power was complex, trusted by Stalin when results mattered most, feared by rivals, respected by soldiers who understood what his presence meant, that the fighting would be heavy, that survival would be uncertain, but that retreat would end. The cost of this approach was enormous. Losses were staggering. Battles were relentless. Victory was never gentle. And yet, without Zhukov's methods, the war on the Eastern Front might have ended very differently. He did not romanticize sacrifice, but he accepted it as the price of survival in a war that offered no alternative. By the time Soviet forces reached Berlin, Zhukov was no longer just a commander. He was the embodiment of endurance, of pressure applied without pause, of a war fought until there was nothing left to give. His legacy remains debated, admired for results, questioned for cost, impossible to ignore. Zhukov represents a truth many histories struggle with, that some wars are won, not by brilliance alone, but by the ability to endure and impose unbearable strain on an enemy who can no longer match it. Tonight, we return to that life lived under constant strain, to the headquarters where maps were stained with exhaustion, to the fronts where defeat was unacceptable, to the commander who did not promise survival, only victory. This is the history of Georgy Zhukov, the man sent when failure was no longer an option. And before we continue, I want to pause for a moment and connect with you. If you're listening right now, take a second and tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you? Is this part of your evening wind down, a quiet moment late at night, or the start of a new day somewhere far away? And if these long, steady journeys into history help you slow down, think deeper, or feel grounded after a long day, I hope you'll consider subscribing. Every subscription helps keep this kind of calm, in-depth storytelling alive. Stories told with patience, respect, and space to breathe. Settle in. This is the story of Georgy Zhukov, November 19th, 1896. In a one-room wooden hut in Strelkovka village, 100 kilometers from Moscow, a baby boy enters a world that will try to kill him before he turns 5. The temperature outside hovers near -20 degrees Celsius. Inside, Maria Zhukova wraps her newborn son, Georgy, in rags because the family owns no proper infant clothing. The hut has no floor, just packed dirt that turns to frozen mud in winter. 87 people live in this village, and most won't see their 42nd birthday. Nothing about this moment suggests that this child, born to illiterate peasants who survive on cabbage and black bread, will one day command the largest army ever assembled and sign the document that ends the Third Reich. But history doesn't announce its giants with fanfare. The Zhukov family exists at the absolute bottom of the Tsarist Russia's social hierarchy. Georgy's father, Konstantin, works as a shoemaker when work is available, which isn't often. His mother, Maria, earns kopecks taking in laundry from families marginally less poor than her own. They share their single room with Georgy's older sister, Maria, and whatever relatives need shelter. The stove that heats the space also serves as the children's bed in winter, the warmest place in a structure that leaks wind through gaps in the walls. Young Georgy's first memories, which he'll later record in his memoirs, are of constant hunger, the smell of cabbage soup stretched thin with water, and the sound of his mother crying when there's no food at all. This is not a childhood that builds sentimentality. It builds something harder. 1808 marks the end of Georgy's childhood. Though he's only 11 years old, his parents make a decision that breaks Maria Zhukova's heart, but saves the family from starvation. They send him to Moscow to work as an apprentice to his mother's brother, a furrier named Mikhail Pilkin. On the morning he leaves, Georgy watches his mother sob openly, gripping his shoulders, knowing she may never see her son again. The journey to Moscow is his first time beyond Strelkovka's boundaries. He arrives in a city of 1 million people carrying everything he owns in a cloth bundle. Uncle Mikhail runs a workshop that makes fur coats for Moscow's merchant class. Georgy sleeps on the workshop floor, rises at 5 each morning, and spends 14 hours daily scraping animal pelts and stitching linings. His formal education ends at 3 years of church school, barely enough to read and write. The boy who will someday outmaneuver German generals educated at elite military academies can barely complete basic arithmetic. But Moscow teaches lessons that no academy provides. Georgy watches how power operates, how merchants treat workers like tools, how a well-timed bribe opens doors while honest requests close them. He learns that survival requires reading people more carefully than books. In 1911, the workshop takes on a commission for the Moscow Gentry Club, and teenage Georgy catches glimpses of Russia's upper classes. He sees army officers in pristine uniforms, their boots polished to mirrors, their bearing radiating the confidence of men who've never doubted their next meal. Something crystallizes in the furrier's apprentice. The military represents a path upward, perhaps the only path for someone born with nothing. When World War I erupts in August 1914, Georgy is 17, still technically too young to serve, but lies about his age and volunteers for the 10th Cavalry Division at Maloyaroslavets. The cavalry seems impossibly glamorous to a boy who's spent his adolescence hunched over animal skins in a basement workshop. Reality arrives with shocking violence. Georgy's first combat experience comes in August 1915 near the town of Lutsk, part of Russia's catastrophic retreat from Galicia. His regiment conducts reconnaissance missions behind Austro-Hungarian lines, which means small groups of horsemen trying not to be killed, while gathering information the generals will probably ignore. On one patrol in October 1916, Georgy's world explodes. His horse steps on an Austro-Hungarian mine, and the detonation throws him 15 meters into a crater. The horse dies instantly. Georgy wakes up deaf in his left ear, blood pouring from his nose and mouth, with a concussion that causes blinding headaches for weeks. The military hospital treats him for 6 weeks, then sends him back to his unit with hearing permanently damaged. But the incident also brings recognition. His squadron commander, Colonel Dragomirov, personally awards him the Cross of St. George, 4th Class, one of Imperial Russia's highest decorations for enlisted men. Dragomirov becomes a figure of unexpected importance in Georgy's development. The colonel is a rare aristocrat who respects ability over birth, and he sees something in the semi-literate cavalryman that others miss. He teaches Georgy basic cavalry tactics, the importance of reconnaissance, the principle that information is worth more than bravery. These lessons, absorbed by a 20-year-old with 3 years of formal schooling, will later inform operations involving millions of men. By 1917, Georgy has become a junior cavalry officer, promoted to non-commissioned rank, leading small units on patrols. Then, March arrives, and the Tsar abdicates, and Russia begins eating itself alive. The army disintegrates as soldiers desert in massive waves. Revolutionary committees challenge officers' authority, and nobody seems certain who's commanding what. Georgy watches this chaos with growing concern. He's not political by nature, not an ideological creature, he's practical. And it's becoming very clear that the old order is dying. Summer 1918 forces every soldier still under arms to make a choice that will define the rest of his life. The Russian Civil War has erupted in full fury, Reds against whites, Bolsheviks against everyone else. Georgy finds himself in a burning village somewhere in central Russia, the name already forgotten in the apocalyptic violence consuming the country. The White Army is advancing from one direction, the Red Army from another, and everyone caught in between faces summary execution, regardless of their politics. A Red Army cavalry regiment arrives first, commanded by an energetic commissar who delivers a speech about the workers' revolution and the necessity of fighting for the new Soviet state. Georgy listens with the calculated attention of someone assessing his survival odds. The whites, he knows, represent the old aristocratic order that kept his family in dirt-floor poverty. The Reds promise something different, though exactly what remains unclear. But more important than ideology is a simpler calculation. The Reds are winning. So, Georgy Zhukov, son of a peasant shoemaker, volunteer in the Tsar's cavalry, survivor of mine explosions and concussions, joins the 1st Moscow Cavalry Regiment of the Red Army. The Civil War's brutality makes World War I seem restrained by comparison. Both sides execute prisoners routinely, burn villages suspected of aiding the enemy, and treat civilians as military resources to be exploited without mercy. Georgy fights in the campaigns against Admiral Kolchak's white forces in the Urals, endless mounted engagements across impossible distances. He contracts typhus in the winter of 1919, nearly dies in a field hospital where the mortality rate exceeds 50%, and returns to his regiment 20 pounds lighter and even harder than before. His commanders notice that young Zhukov, now 23 years old, possesses an unusual quality. He's utterly uninterested in revolutionary rhetoric, but fanatically devoted to military efficiency. He drills his squadron relentlessly, maintains discipline when other units dissolve into armed mobs, and develops a reputation for getting his men through impossible situations. These traits will define his entire career. Political pragmatism masking intense professional competence. By 1920, the Civil War is effectively over, the Reds victorious, and Georgy has survived when millions haven't. He's 24 years old, partially deaf, scarred by shrapnel and disease, and possessed of exactly 3 years of formal education. He's also a Red Army cavalry officer in an army that's about to become one of the most formidable military machines in history. The Soviet state is desperate for officers who can bridge the gap between the old Tsarist military professionalism and the new revolutionary ideology. Georgy fits this description perfectly because he cares about neither tradition nor politics, only winning. His superiors recognize this and send him for further training. In 1923, he receives orders to report to the Higher Cavalry School in Leningrad, an institution that will transform the semi-literate peasant into a professional military commander. He travels there knowing nothing of strategy, logistics, or modern warfare theory. Within 4 years, he'll be lecturing other officers on tank doctrine. The journey from Strelkovka to Leningrad spans more than just the 600 kilometers of Russian landscape. It represents an almost impossible ascent from the lowest depths of Tsarist society into the new Soviet military elite. But this transformation carries a cost that won't become fully apparent for 2 more decades. The boy who left his mother crying in a village of 87 people has become a man who understands that sentimentality is a luxury for those who've never been truly hungry. The teenager who polished officers' boots in his mind while scraping fur pelts has learned that deference and obedience are temporary tactics, not permanent conditions. And the cavalry trooper who survived mine blasts and typhus has internalized the fundamental lesson that will define his approach to command. Survival requires accepting casualties, sometimes including your own, without hesitation or remorse. These aren't the credentials that military academies celebrate, but they're exactly the qualifications necessary for the apocalyptic war that awaits. The peasant son is about to become a general. And Russia will drown in blood, proving it was the right choice. Leningrad, 1923. Georgy Zhukov sits in a classroom at the higher cavalry school, staring at a textbook on ballistics that might as well be written in Sanskrit. The equations covering the page mean nothing to a man whose mathematical education ended at basic arithmetic when he was 11. Around him, other officers, many from educated backgrounds, work through the problems with relative ease. Zhukov's knuckles turn white as he grips his pencil, determined not to reveal his inadequacy. He's 27 years old, a decorated Civil War veteran, and secretly terrified that his lack of formal education will expose him as fundamentally unsuited for professional military service. Every lecture on logistics, every tactical exercise involving maps and coordinate systems, every discussion of contemporary military theory highlights the canyon between his rural peasant background and the sophistication expected of modern officers. Yet something in him refuses to fail. So he does what he's done since childhood. He survives through brutal self-discipline. The Higher Cavalry School in 1923 represents something revolutionary in military education, though not in the way Soviet propaganda claims. The Red Army has a massive problem. The Civil War killed or exiled most of the Tsarist Russia's professional officer corps, leaving the new Soviet state with thousands of positions requiring technical expertise that simply doesn't exist among the revolutionary enthusiasts who currently fill the ranks. The solution is to take promising veterans like Zhukov and forcibly educate them, cramming years of military science into compressed courses. Zhukov attacks his studies with manic intensity, staying awake until 2 or 3 in the morning, reading textbooks, copying equations. He doesn't understand until repetition brings comprehension. His instructors note both his limitations and his ferocious determination. One evaluation from December 1923 describes him as mathematically deficient but possessing unusual practical judgment and absolute refusal to accept defeat. These qualities matter more than calculus in the chaos of actual combat, but the real education happens outside the formal curriculum. The Soviet Union in the 1920s is conducting a secret military collaboration with Germany that violates the Treaty of Versailles and creates bizarre situations. Forbidden from maintaining substantial armed forces, Germany has negotiated agreements allowing them to test prohibited weapons on Soviet territory, away from Allied inspectors. In 1931, Zhukov receives orders to inspect a German tank training facility near Kazan, officially a tractor school, but actually a proving ground for panzer tactics. He arrives expecting to see primitive experiments with armored vehicles. Instead, he observes 10 Panzer I prototypes conducting maneuvers that demonstrate concepts completely alien to cavalry-minded Soviet officers. The German instructors, 120 men operating under cover identities, have developed coordinated attacks using radio communication between tanks, close air support doctrine, and breakthrough tactics that ignore traditional front lines. Zhukov watches in fascinated horror as tanks bypass strong points entirely, racing into rear areas to destroy supply lines and headquarters. The moment marks his intellectual conversion from cavalry romanticism to mechanized warfare pragmatism. He's spent his entire military career in mounted units, understanding warfare through the lens of horses, sabers, and personal courage. The German exercises prove that this entire conceptual framework is obsolete. Tanks aren't just armored cavalry. They're fundamentally different weapons that enable entirely new operational concepts. A cavalry charge, no matter how brave, can be stopped by machine guns and barbed wire, as the Great War proved with industrial efficiency. But tanks can smash through fortifications, maintain momentum, and create chaos in ways that foot-mobile infantry and horsemen simply cannot. Zhukov returns to his command at the 4th Cavalry Division in Minsk and begins writing reports arguing that the Red Army must transition to mechanized formations. In 1933, he publishes an article in Military Herald titled "The Role of Mechanized Formations in Modern Operations," a dry academic piece that demonstrates how completely he's absorbed the German lessons. His superiors read it with interest. His career begins accelerating. But acceleration in the Soviet military during the 1930s carries deadly risks. The state Zhukov serves is entering one of history's most paranoid periods. when competence becomes suspicious and expertise suggests potential treachery. Joseph Stalin, having consolidated power after Lenin's death, sees enemies everywhere, particularly in the military. The army represents the only institution capable of threatening his rule, so he decides to eliminate any potential challenge through systematic terror. The pretext arrives in 1937 when Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, uncovers a vast conspiracy supposedly involving the military's senior leadership and German intelligence. The evidence is fabricated through torture, but that barely matters in the system Stalin has created. On June 11, 1937, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the Red Army's most brilliant theorist and the architect of Soviet mechanized warfare doctrine, is arrested on charges of treason. 8 days later, he's executed. Tukhachevsky's death sends shockwaves through every officer who's studied modern warfare, because the executed marshal was the intellectual force behind the tank armies Zhukov now advocates. Worse, Tukhachevsky had personally mentored many younger officers, including Zhukov. Every interaction, every letter, every professional connection becomes potential evidence of conspiracy. In July 1937, Zhukov, now commanding the Byelorussian military district, receives a visit from NKVD interrogators. They question him for 3 days about his relationship with Tukhachevsky, about conversations regarding German military cooperation, about his own loyalty to Stalin and the Soviet state. The interrogation occurs in a basement room in Minsk. Just him and 2 NKVD officers who carry folders containing files on his entire career. They ask questions designed to trap him into contradictions. They suggest that his interest in mechanized warfare proves he's part of the German conspiracy. They inform him that former colleagues have already confessed and implicated him. Zhukov understands with absolute clarity that his survival depends on political theater rather than truth. He denounces Tukhachevsky as a traitor, claims he never truly trusted him, invents suspicions he supposedly harbored. He volunteers names of other officers who seemed too interested in German tactics. He performs loyalty to Stalin with the desperate energy of a man who knows that hesitation equals death. The performance works, barely. The NKVD releases him without charges, but the file remains open. A permanent threat. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin's purges decimate the Red Army officer corps with statistical brutality that defies belief. 3 of 5 marshals are executed. 13 of 15 army commanders disappear into NKVD prisons. 8 of 9 admirals, 50 of 57 corps commanders, 154 of 186 divisional commanders, all gone, shot in basement cells or worked to death in labor camps. The purges kill approximately 40,000 officers, leaving the Red Army commanded by survivors who've learned that political loyalty matters infinitely more than military competence. Yet Zhukov not only survives but prospers, which tells you everything about his character that needs telling. In January 1938, he's promoted to command the Fourth Army. In June 1938, he takes over the Byelorussian military district, one of the Soviet Union's most important military regions. His rapid advancement during the height of the terror isn't coincidental. The purges create massive vacancies in command positions, and Stalin needs officers who combine professional competence with demonstrated political reliability. Zhukov fits this description perfectly because he's shown himself willing to betray colleagues, denounce mentors, and subsume everything to survival. These aren't qualities that inspire moral admiration, but they're exactly the characteristics required to function in Stalin's Soviet Union. The man who emerges from the purges is harder, colder, more ruthless than the cavalry officer who entered the higher cavalry school 15 years earlier. His first wife, Maria, notices the change and cannot live with what her husband has become. In 1937, as the purges intensify, she leaves him, taking their daughters. Zhukov doesn't fight the separation. Perhaps he recognizes that the necessities of survival have transformed him into someone unsuitable for normal human relationships. His colleagues observe that he becomes increasingly abrupt, intolerant of mistakes, willing to relieve or even arrest subordinates for minor failures. The NKVD maintains surveillance on all senior officers, reading their mail, tapping their phones, recording their conversations. Zhukov knows he's watched constantly and adapts his behavior accordingly. He becomes a master of the political performance required to thrive in this environment, publicly lauding Stalin in every speech, attributing all success to the party's wise leadership, never questioning orders no matter how senseless. Privately, he studies German military publications and continues developing mechanized warfare concepts. The contradiction doesn't trouble him. Survival requires duplicity. By 1939, the purges have finally slowed, mostly because Stalin has killed almost everyone he considers threatening. The Red Army, though devastated by losing most of its experienced leadership, still exists as a massive institution of approximately 2 million men. Zhukov commands one of its most important districts, controls several tank brigades, and has established a reputation as an expert on mechanized operations. He's 42 years old, a full general, a survivor of World War, Revolution, Civil War, typhus, and Stalin's terror. The journey from one-room hut in Strelkovka to command of the Byelorussian military district represents an almost miraculous ascent, the kind of career trajectory possible only in a revolutionary state that destroyed traditional barriers. But the cost of this rise includes moral compromises so profound that they fundamentally reshape who Georgy Zhukov is. The peasant's son has learned cavalry tactics, then tank warfare, then political survival. The final lesson proves most useful. In 2 months, he'll receive orders to proceed to Mongolia to deal with a border incident involving Japanese forces. The assignment seems like a minor frontier problem, a test of his command abilities in an obscure theater. It will instead provide the laboratory where he'll prove that everything he's learned about mechanized warfare works in practice, and it will kill 25,000 Soviet soldiers in the process. May 28, 1939. Georgy Zhukov steps off a military transport aircraft onto the Mongolian steppe and confronts a landscape so alien it might be another planet. The grass stretches endlessly in every direction, broken only by low hills and the occasional rocky outcrop. The temperature hovers near 35 degrees Celsius, and there's no shade anywhere. 200 meters from the airstrip, 3 burning BT-5 tanks send black smoke into the crystalline sky. Japanese artillery has destroyed them, along with another 12 tanks that lie scattered across the battlefield like broken toys. The wreckage represents everything wrong with the current Soviet military response to the crisis at Khalkhin Gol, a river marking the disputed border between Mongolia and Manchukuo, Japan's puppet state. Soviet and Mongolian forces have been fighting Japanese troops here for weeks, accomplishing nothing except piling up casualties. Moscow has sent Zhukov to fix the situation. He surveys the burning tanks and understands immediately that fixing it will require methods that will horrify anyone with conventional military thinking or basic human decency. The conflict began on May 11th, when Japanese and Manchukuoan forces crossed the Khalkhin Gol River, claiming the territory belonged to Manchukuo. While Mongolia insisted it was Mongolian, this kind of border dispute might normally be resolved through negotiation. But Japan in 1939 is testing Soviet resolve across multiple flashpoints, probing for weakness. Initial Soviet responses have been disastrous. The local commander launched piecemeal armored counterattacks that Japanese anti-tank guns slaughtered with contemptuous ease. Soviet aircraft flew missions without coordination, losing planes to Japanese fighters that clearly outmatched Soviet models in this theater. By late May, the situation has devolved into a bloody stalemate along a 30-kilometer front, with casualties mounting and no clear Soviet advantage. Stalin views this as intolerable. The Soviet Union cannot appear weak to Japan, particularly not while simultaneously facing potential threats from Germany in the West. Hence, Zhukov's sudden deployment to this forgotten corner of Central Asia with explicit instructions demonstrate overwhelming Soviet military superiority. Zhukov's first actions upon arrival reveal the commander he's becoming. He relieves the existing front commander and 3 divisional commanders within 24 hours, sending them back to Moscow in disgrace. He tours the forward positions personally, frequently under Japanese artillery fire, assessing the terrain and Soviet defensive arrangements. What he finds disgusts him professionally. Soviet forces are scattered in penny packets across the front, without coordination or mutual support. There's no centralized air control, no unified artillery command, no coherent logistics system. Units are attacking independently whenever their commanders feel aggressive, achieving nothing except creating targets for Japanese gunners. The entire arrangement violates every principle of modern mechanized warfare that Zhukov has spent a decade studying. So, he stops all offensive operations immediately and begins rebuilding the Soviet force from scratch, applying Tukhachevsky's deep battle doctrine that the Purges suppressed but that Zhukov knows represents the future of warfare. The rebuilding happens in complete secrecy, a deception operation that prefigures later Soviet strategic Maskirovka. From June through early August, Zhukov assembles a massive force 650 kilometers from the nearest Soviet railroad, all supplies transported by truck across roadless steppe. He concentrates 498 tanks, 346 armored cars, 580 aircraft, and 57,000 troops, creating a combined arms force unlike anything previously seen in Asia. The logistics alone represent a staggering achievement. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every bag of rice for the Mongolian troops has to be trucked across terrain that turns to boot-sucking mud when it rains. Zhukov establishes massive supply dumps, camouflage dumps, to prevent Japanese aerial reconnaissance from discovering the buildup. He brings in his best officers from various commands, handpicking subordinates based on demonstrated competence rather than political connections. He drills the force relentlessly, rehearsing the coming offensive in the exercises that mimic the actual terrain. And he does all this while maintaining an active defense that convinces Japanese intelligence nothing unusual is happening. The Japanese, commanded by Lieutenant General Michitaro Komatsubara, have no idea what's coming. Their intelligence estimates Soviet strength in the region at approximately 35,000 troops with minimal armor. They've observed some increase in Soviet activity, but attribute it to defensive reinforcement rather than offensive preparation. Komatsubara, a competent but conventional officer, believes he faces a manageable threat. His forces hold strong defensive positions along the east bank of the Khalkhin Gol, anchored on high ground with excellent fields of fire. The Japanese have proven throughout the summer that they're formidable fighters, disciplined and brave, willing to defend positions until annihilated. Komatsubara expects the Soviets to launch another poorly coordinated attack that his artillery and infantry will destroy at minimal cost. He's prepared for the Soviet Army of May. He's not prepared for the mechanized force Zhukov has created in secret. August 20th, 1939, 5:45 in the morning. The sky over Khalkhin Gol erupts as 150 Soviet bombers strike Japanese positions with 250 tons of bombs. Komatsubara is still in his headquarters when the first explosions walk across Japanese trenches. He rushes outside to witness his defensive line disappearing under a curtain of fire. The bombing continues for 90 minutes, systematically targeting every Japanese strongpoint that Soviet reconnaissance has identified. As the last bombers turn away, Soviet artillery opens fire. 542 guns, pre-positioned in hidden emplacements, begin a creeping barrage that advances across Japanese positions at precisely calculated intervals. The artillery concentration achieves 1 gun per 5 meters of front, a density that simply overwhelms Japanese defenses. Then the tanks appear. 498 armored vehicles emerge from concealed positions and begin a massive double envelopment. The northern and southern pincers driving deep into Japanese rear areas while maintaining coordination through radio communication. Zhukov has studied German tank tactics at Kazan and replicated them with brutal efficiency. The Japanese 23rd Division, anchoring the center of Komatsubara's line, realizes within hours that it's facing catastrophe. Soviet tank columns are already 20 kilometers into Japanese rear areas, cutting supply lines and overwhelming reserve positions. Japanese anti-tank guns, which proved so effective against Soviet piecemeal attacks in May and June, cannot stop coordinated armored assaults supported by artillery and air power. The Soviet tanks, primarily BT-5 and BT-7 models designed for exactly this kind of rapid exploitation, maintain speeds of 30 to 40 kilometers per hour across open steppe, faster than Japanese infantry can react. By evening of August 20th, the encirclement is clearly forming. Komatsubara sends desperate messages to higher headquarters requesting permission to withdraw, but the Japanese military culture makes retreat without explicit orders essentially impossible. His forces stay in place and die. August 27th marks the encirclement's completion. Soviet pincers meet west of the Japanese main positions, trapping the entire 23rd Division and substantial elements of other units inside a pocket approximately 15 kilometers across. 61,000 Japanese and Manchukuoan troops face annihilation. Komatsubara attempts breakout attacks with characteristic Japanese ferocity, throwing infantry against Soviet tanks in suicide charges that achieve nothing except adding to the casualty count. Soviet flamethrower tanks, used here for the first time in combat, proved devastatingly effective against Japanese infantry in trenches. The psychological impact of watching men burn alive breaks even the disciplined Japanese will to resist. By August 29th, organized Japanese resistance inside the pocket has collapsed into isolated strongpoints where officers lead their remaining men in the final banzai charges rather than surrender. Zhukov directs the final assault from a forward command post, watching through binoculars as Soviet artillery pounds the last Japanese positions into lunar landscape. August 31st brings the operation's conclusion. General Komatsubara's headquarters is overrun, and he barely escapes capture, fleeing east with a handful of staff officers. The Battle of Khalkhin Gol has cost Japan 61,000 casualties, including 45,000 dead. The 23rd Division has effectively ceased to exist. Soviet losses are 25,000 casualties, including 9,000 dead, a ratio of approximately 1 Soviet casualty for every 2.4 Japanese casualties. These numbers might seem favorable until you realize that Zhukov commanded a force with overwhelming numerical and material superiority. A competent defensive battle should have produced far lower Soviet losses, but Zhukov isn't interested in minimizing casualties. He's interested in destroying the enemy completely, regardless of cost. His own forces suffered heavily because he pushed attacks relentlessly, accepting losses to maintain operational momentum, refusing to slow down even when individual units reported crippling casualties. The aftermath reveals both Zhukov's military genius and his moral void. He's proven that Soviet mechanized warfare doctrine works brilliantly when properly applied. The double envelopment at Khalkhin Gol demonstrates mastery of tank warfare, air-ground coordination, artillery concentration, and logistics that few commanders in any army could match. He's inflicted the most significant defeat Japan has suffered in its expansion across Asia, a defeat so complete that Japanese leadership will avoid further conflicts with the Soviet Union, eventually signing a neutrality pact that frees Stalin to move Siberian divisions west when Germany invades. From a strategic perspective, Khalkhin Gol is a masterpiece, but Zhukov has also executed 20 Soviet officers during the battle for cowardice, which often meant simply reporting that their units were too depleted to attack. He's driven his forces without mercy, accepting casualty rates that would have caused other commanders to pause. When a tank brigade commander reported he'd lost 60% of his armor and requested permission to withdraw for reorganization, Zhukov relieved him on the spot and ordered the remaining tanks forward. This pattern, victory achieved through ruthless disregard for casualties, will define his entire career. September 9th, 1939. Georgy Zhukov returns to Moscow in triumph. Stalin personally greets him at the Kremlin, awards him the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, and promotes him to full general. Soviet propaganda transforms Khalkhin Gol into a glorious victory that proves Soviet military superiority and Stalin's wise leadership. Newspapers never mention the 25,000 casualties or the executed officers. Zhukov gives a speech at the Frunze Military Academy, where he explains the operation's technical aspects to other senior commanders. His analysis is brilliantly clear. Mechanized warfare requires overwhelming concentration of force at decisive points. acceptance of risks on secondary sectors, and relentless exploitation of success regardless of flank security concerns. Everything he says violates traditional military wisdom about maintaining balanced formations and secure supply lines. Everything he says is correct. The German military attaché in Moscow obtains a copy of Zhukov's lecture notes and sends them to Berlin. German intelligence analysts read them and file the report away. This proves to be one of history's most catastrophic intelligence failures. If German planners had understood what Zhukov demonstrated at Khalkhin Goal, they might have reconsidered Operation Barbarossa, but nobody in Berlin believes that Soviet generals could possibly be competent. That assumption will kill 3 million German soldiers. Moscow, September 1st, 1939. Georgy Zhukov walks through the Kremlin's Spassky Gate into a reception room where Stalin waits to pin the Hero of the Soviet Union medal on his uniform. The timing is extraordinary, almost suspicious in its perfection. Germany has invaded Poland this very morning, beginning World War II in Europe, and Stalin is celebrating a Soviet military victory on the opposite end of the empire. The message to Germany and to the Soviet people is clear. The Soviet Union is a military power that wins its battles decisively. Zhukov stands at attention while Stalin, shorter than the general, reaches up to attach the gold star to his chest. Stalin's eyes, yellowish and reptilian in the harsh electric light, study Zhukov's face as if assessing a potentially useful tool. The moment crystallizes something important. Zhukov has entered the inner circle, the group of Soviet officials whose competence makes them simultaneously indispensable and dangerous. Stalin needs generals who can win, but he also fears them because military competence plus popularity equals potential threat to his rule. The hero's welcome includes promotions, public celebrations, and a new assignment that reveals Stalin's strategic priorities. In June 1940, Zhukov takes command of the Kiev military district, one of the most critical positions in the Soviet military structure. The Kiev district covers Ukraine, directly adjacent to the new Soviet-German border created by their joint dismemberment of Poland. Hitler and Stalin have signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement that fooled nobody about underlying hostilities, merely postponing inevitable conflict. Zhukov's assignment to Kiev means Stalin wants his most successful general positioned where war with Germany will begin. But there's a deadly catch. Stalin forbids serious defensive preparations because such preparations might provoke Hitler. This insane logic forces Zhukov into an impossible position. He can see German forces massing across the border. He knows war is coming. But he cannot order the fortifications, supply depots, or troop dispositions necessary to defend effectively. Zhukov tries anyway, demonstrating either courage or stupidity in nearly equal measure. Throughout late 1940, he begins unauthorized construction of defensive positions along the western Bug River, the new border. He orders engineers to lay minefields, build anti-tank ditches, and establish fortified zones, covering likely German approach routes. These preparations violate Stalin's explicit orders to avoid provocative activities. When NKVD informants report Zhukov's unauthorized fortification work, Stalin summons him to Moscow for an unpleasant conversation. The meeting, reconstructed from multiple sources, including Zhukov's carefully censored memoirs, involves Stalin accusing Zhukov of trying to start a war with Germany through aggressive defensive preparations. Zhukov argues, with remarkable boldness considering he's addressing history's most prolific murderer, that defensive preparations prevent wars by deterring attacks. Stalin is unmoved. He orders Zhukov to halt fortification work immediately. Zhukov complies because the alternative is arrest and execution. The defensive works stop, leaving Soviet forces exposed along the entire western frontier. January 13, 1941, marks a peculiar moment in Soviet military history. The Red Army conducts war games at the General Staff Building in Moscow, simulating a German invasion of the Soviet Union. Zhukov is assigned to play the German side, while General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Western Front, plays the Soviet defender. The scenario posits a German attack through Poland toward Minsk and Moscow. Zhukov, applying everything he's learned about mechanized warfare and German tactics, launches a concentrated armored assault that smashes through Pavlov's forward defenses, bypasses strong points, and races into the Soviet rear. His German forces reach Minsk in 8 days, a scenario that shocks the observers because it demonstrates Soviet vulnerability. The real catastrophe is that Stalin and the general staff observe this war game. Watch Zhukov prove that German blitzkrieg tactics will work against Soviet dispositions, and do nothing to correct the situation. Pavlov, humiliated by his poor performance, remains in command of the Western Front. Stalin apparently interprets the war game as evidence of Zhukov's intelligence rather than a warning about real German capabilities. January 14th. The day after proving Soviet defenses are inadequate, Zhukov receives promotion to Chief of General Staff. He's now the second-ranking military officer in the Soviet Union, junior only to Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko, responsible for planning and coordinating operations across all fronts. The promotion gives Zhukov access to intelligence that confirms his worst fears. Soviet intelligence services, particularly the GRU military intelligence and NKVD foreign operations, are providing detailed reporting on German preparations for invasion. Richard Sorge, a Soviet spy embedded in the German embassy in Tokyo, sends reports documenting German troop movements towards Soviet borders. Other sources report similar activity. By March 1941, GRU estimates place approximately 180 German divisions in Poland and East Prussia, a concentration that has no conceivable purpose except attacking the Soviet Union. Zhukov compiles all this intelligence into reports for Stalin, arguing that German invasion is imminent and inevitable. Stalin's response to increasingly urgent warnings reveals either remarkable stupidity or willful blindness, possibly both. On March 20th, Zhukov presents a particularly detailed intelligence summary, showing German forces massing in invasion positions. Stalin reads the report, then dismisses it as British disinformation. His reasoning, such as it is, holds that Britain wants to provoke war between Germany and the Soviet Union to save itself from German pressure. Therefore, any intelligence suggesting German hostility must be British fabrication. This logic requires ignoring the fact that multiple independent sources, including German defectors and Soviet agents inside German military units, are all reporting the same information. Stalin refuses to mobilize Soviet forces, refuses to authorize serious defensive preparations, and explicitly forbids any actions that might give Hitler an excuse to claim provocation. Zhukov finds himself in the surreal position of commanding the Red Army while being forbidden from preparing it for the war he knows is coming. The relationship between Stalin and Zhukov during these months combines mutual need with mutual suspicion. Stalin recognizes that Zhukov is the Soviet Union's most competent general, perhaps the only senior commander who truly understands modern mechanized warfare. But Zhukov's competence makes him politically threatening. The NKVD maintains constant surveillance, reading Zhukov's mail, tapping his phones, and reporting any statements that might indicate disloyalty. Zhukov, understanding perfectly well that he's monitored, governs his behavior accordingly. He praises Stalin in every speech, attributes all military success to party leadership, and never openly questions orders, no matter how criminally stupid those orders are. But privately, in discussions with trusted subordinates, he expresses growing alarm about Soviet unpreparedness. Between January and June 1941, Zhukov has at least 5 documented heated arguments with Stalin about military readiness. 2 of these arguments result in Stalin threatening Zhukov with arrest, yet Stalin doesn't follow through because he needs Zhukov too much. May 15, 1941. Richard Sorge sends a telegram from Tokyo providing the exact date of German invasion, June 22nd. The GRU forwards Sorge's intelligence to Stalin within hours. Zhukov receives a copy and immediately requests an emergency meeting with Stalin. The meeting occurs the next day, with Zhukov arguing passionately that the Soviet Union must mobilize immediately, move reserves forward, and establish defensive lines. He proposes, remarkably, a Soviet preemptive strike into Poland, attacking German concentrations before they can organize their own offensive. This suggestion is both strategically sound and politically insane. Stalin rejects it instantly, calling it a provocation that would hand Hitler justification for war. Zhukov leaves the meeting knowing that his proposals will be ignored and that catastrophe is approximately 5 weeks away. The knowledge that disaster is preventable but that politics make prevention impossible creates a burden few commanders have carried. Zhukov cannot save the millions of Soviet soldiers who will die in the coming weeks because Stalin won't allow it. The final weeks before Barbarossa acquire a dreamlike quality of horror where everyone can see the approaching catastrophe but cannot act to prevent it. German reconnaissance flights penetrate deep into Soviet territory daily, photographing airfields, supply depots, and military installations. Soviet anti-aircraft units are forbidden from firing on these aircraft because shooting down German planes might be provocative. German deserters cross the border and report to Soviet intelligence that invasion is scheduled for late June. NKVD border guards forward these reports through proper channels, where they disappear into Stalin's denial. On June 13th, the Soviet news agency TASS publishes a statement declaring rumors of German-Soviet tensions to be baseless lies, essentially reassuring Hitler that the Soviet Union won't resist his attack. Zhukov watches this unfold with the desperate frustration of a man who knows exactly what's coming but cannot warn the potential victims. June 21st, 1941. Zhukov spends the evening in his General Staff office reviewing the latest intelligence reports. Every indicator points to attack within hours. German artillery units have moved into forward positions. Luftwaffe squadrons have been brought to maximum readiness. Soviet border guards report hearing sounds of massed troop movements on the German side. At 8:30 in the evening, a German deserter crosses the border near Koden and tells Soviet interrogators that the attack will begin at 4 in the morning. This report reaches Zhukov around 11 o'clock. He immediately calls Stalin, waking him, requesting permission to order Soviet forces to combat readiness. Stalin, groggy and irritated, asks whether this might be a German provocation designed to justify their own attack if Soviet forces mobilize. Zhukov, with remarkable restraint considering the circumstances, explains that the deserters' information matches all other intelligence. Stalin reluctantly authorizes a limited alert, but forbids any aggressive actions. Zhukov dictates Directive Number 1, ordering Soviet forces to man defensive positions, but not to cross the border under any circumstances. The directive reaches most units between midnight and 2 in the morning, approximately 90 minutes before 3 million German soldiers attack. The peasant son who became Chief of General Staff spends the final hours of peace knowing that everything he's warned about is about to happen. The Soviet Union is about to experience military catastrophe unprecedented in modern history. Millions of soldiers are deployed in positions that make no sense, commanded by officers whose competence varies wildly, supported by logistics systems that barely function. Stalin's refusal to mobilize means Soviet forces will meet the German onslaught half asleep, unprepared, and shocked. Zhukov knows all this because he's studied German tactics extensively, because he demonstrated exactly how it would happen in January's war games, and because every intelligence report for months has described the coming attack in accurate detail. The knowledge doesn't help. He cannot prevent what's coming. All he can do is survive the blame that will inevitably fall on the military leadership for a disaster created by political stupidity. As he sits in his office on the night of June 21st, waiting for the phone calls that will report the end of the world, Georgy Zhukov understands that his career, his life, and his country are about to be tested in ways that will make Khalkhin goal seem like a minor skirmish. The real war is about to begin, and nothing in his experience has prepared him for its scale. June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. The phone on Georgy Zhukov's desk erupts with a violence that shatters the pre-dawn silence in his General Staff office. He grabs the receiver, knowing already what the call will report, but hoping desperately that he's wrong. The voice on the other end belongs to the duty officer at Western Front headquarters in Minsk, and it's shaking with panic. German artillery is bombarding Soviet positions across the entire frontier. Luftwaffe bombers are striking airfields. Parachutists are landing behind Soviet lines. The war has begun, And it's begun with exactly the catastrophic surprise that Zhukov warned about for months. He orders the duty officer to implement defensive protocols, then immediately calls Stalin's Dasha. The dictator is asleep, and his bodyguards refuse to wake him. Zhukov, with remarkable courage or foolishness, orders them to wake Stalin immediately because Germany is invading the Soviet Union. The bodyguards reluctantly comply. Stalin comes to the phone, listens to Zhukov's report, and says nothing for several seconds. Then he asks in a voice stripped of affect whether this might be a provocation by German generals acting without Hitler's knowledge. Zhukov's face goes white. By 7:15 that morning, the scale of the disaster becomes horrifically clear. Reports flooding into the general staff paint a picture of comprehensive destruction across the entire western frontier. The Luftwaffe has caught Soviet aviation on the ground, destroying approximately 1,200 aircraft in the first 3 hours of war. Soviet airfields, helpfully positioned close to the border, per Stalin's orders to avoid provocative defensive depth, proved to be perfectly arranged killing grounds. German bombers find neat rows of planes parked wingtip to wingtip, exactly as they appeared in reconnaissance photographs, and methodically annihilate them. At Bialystok airfield alone, the Germans destroy 127 aircraft before a single Soviet fighter can scramble. Simultaneously, German armored spearheads are smashing through Soviet border defenses using precisely the tactics Zhukov demonstrated in January's war games. Panzer divisions bypass strong points, ignore flanks, and drive deep into Soviet rear areas targeting headquarters, supply dumps, and communication nodes. Soviet commanders cannot coordinate responses because German attacks have destroyed phone lines, overrun command posts, and created chaos that spreads faster than information. Stalin convenes an emergency meeting of the State Defense Committee at 7:30. Zhukov arrives to find Stalin still clinging to the delusion that this might be an unauthorized action by rogue German generals. He asks Zhukov whether the Soviet Union should attempt diplomatic contact with Germany to resolve the misunderstanding. Zhukov, with the desperate patience of someone explaining obvious reality to a dangerous madman, states that 3 million German soldiers, supported by 4,000 tanks and 5,000 aircraft, do not represent a misunderstanding. Stalin finally accepts that war has begun. Then he makes decisions that transform disaster into apocalypse. He orders Directive Number 2, instructing Soviet forces to immediately launch counteroffensives to drive the invaders back across the border. Zhukov attempts to explain that Soviet forces are scattered, surprised, and in many cases already destroyed, making coordinated counterattacks impossible. Stalin insists. The directive goes out at 7:30, ordering operations that every competent officer knows are impossible, but that everyone must attempt because Stalin has commanded it. The counterattacks ordered by Directive Number 2 epitomize everything wrong with Soviet command and control in June 1941. Local commanders receive orders to attack German forces when they don't know where those forces are, when their own units are scattered and uncoordinated, and when German air superiority makes daylight movement suicidal. Soviet tank brigades, which might be effective if concentrated properly, launch piecemeal attacks wherever their commanders happen to be, achieving nothing except providing target practice for German anti-tank guns. The Soviet 6th and 11th Mechanized Corps attempt a counterattack near Grodno on June 23rd with approximately 600 tanks. German Stukas destroy half of them before they reach German positions. Anti-tank guns destroy most of the rest. The entire operation collapses within 6 hours, leaving burning hulks scattered across Lithuanian countryside. This scene repeats across the entire front. Brave Soviet soldiers executing impossible orders and dying in vast numbers without achieving anything except filling mass graves. June 28th brings news that crystallizes the catastrophe's magnitude. Minsk has fallen. The entire Soviet Western Front, commanded by General Dmitry Pavlov, the same officer who lost the January war games to Zhukov, has been encircled. 600,000 Soviet soldiers are trapped in a pocket west of Minsk as German panzer divisions meet east of the city, completing an encirclement that demonstrates precisely what Zhukov warned would happen. Pavlov's front has effectively ceased to exist as a coherent military formation. Soviet losses in the first week of war exceed 2,000 aircraft destroyed, 6,000 tanks lost, and 300,000 casualties including dead, wounded, and missing. The German advance achieves an average of 30 kilometers per day, an operational tempo that Soviet forces simply cannot match or counter. General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group reaches Smolensk by July the 16th, having covered 400 kilometers in less than a month. The road to Moscow lies open. June 30th marks Zhukov's most significant personal crisis since the NKVD interrogations during the Purges. Stalin summons him to the Kremlin for a meeting that devolves into mutual recrimination and rage. Stalin demands that Zhukov explain how the Soviet military has lost half of Belarusia in 8 days. Zhukov, abandoning the careful political deference that's kept him alive, explodes. He reminds Stalin that he warned about German invasion for months. He points out that Stalin forbade defensive preparations and mobilization. He states with suicidal clarity that Soviet forces are losing because Stalin's orders placed them in indefensible positions and prohibited logical defensive responses. Stalin's face turns dark red. He asks Zhukov if he's accusing the party leadership of incompetence. Zhukov, perhaps recognizing he's already crossed the line into dangerous territory, pushes further. He argues that the Western Front must retreat to defensible lines, that Kiev must be evacuated to save the forces there, that trying to hold everything will lose everything. Stalin's response is 2 words: get out. July 29, 1941. Stalin relieves Georgy Zhukov as Chief of General Staff. The dismissal comes via a terse announcement during a Stavka meeting, with no explanation beyond that Zhukov is being reassigned. Marshal Boris Shaposhnikov replaces him, a competent officer but one lacking Zhukov's operational experience or willingness to argue with Stalin. The relief appears to be a disgrace, punishment for speaking truth to power, evidence that Zhukov has finally gone too far in challenging Stalin's authority. Soviet officers who've spent years learning to read political signals interpret the move as Zhukov's fall from grace, possibly a prelude to arrest and execution. Several avoid him in the halls of the General Staff Building, not wanting guilt by association. Zhukov cleans out his office expecting NKVD men to arrive at any moment. The knock never comes. Instead, he receives orders to report to Reserve Front headquarters to take command of forces defending the Yelnya salient east of Smolensk. The assignment is simultaneously a demotion and a reprieve. Stalin is removing Zhukov from high-level planning, but not eliminating him, which suggests that despite everything, the dictator recognizes that he needs his most competent general alive. The disaster continues to metastasize while Zhukov travels to his new command. On August 7th, German forces complete another massive encirclement at Uman, trapping 103,000 Soviet soldiers. The pattern established at Minsk repeats with industrial efficiency. German panzer spearheads bypass Soviet strongpoints, race into rear areas, link up to create pockets, then methodically destroy the trapped forces. Soviet commanders launch desperate breakout attempts that mostly fail because German mobile units can react faster than Soviet foot infantry can move. The casualty ratios are horrifying. For every German soldier killed or wounded, approximately 4 Soviet soldiers die or disappear. The mathematics of attrition at this rate mean the Soviet Union will run out of trained soldiers before Germany does. By the end of July, Soviet losses exceed 1 million casualties. German losses are approximately 200,000. If this continues, the Red Army will cease to exist as an effective fighting force sometime in late autumn. Yet, underneath the catastrophe, patterns emerge that will eventually matter. Soviet soldiers, even when surrounded and cut off, frequently fight with desperate courage rather than surrender. German commanders expect Soviet pockets to collapse quickly like French forces did in 1940. But Soviet units often resist for days or weeks, tying down German forces and disrupting operational tempo. Soviet workers in threatened regions dismantle factory equipment and evacuated east on trains, beginning a massive industrial relocation that will prove crucial to eventual survival. The scorched earth policy, crude and brutal, denies German forces food and shelter that their logistics system cannot provide. Most importantly, the Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, continues to exist. New divisions form in the Urals and Siberia. Factories begin producing replacement equipment. The Soviet system, forged by revolutionary violence and maintained through terror, proves remarkably resilient even under military disaster that would shatter most states. Zhukov arrives at Yelnya in early August and immediately recognizes that Stalin, despite claiming to punish him, has actually placed him in a position of critical importance. The Yelnya salient represents the closest German penetration toward Moscow, a bulge in the lines that threatens to become a springboard for offensive operations against the capital. Soviet forces have launched unsuccessful attacks against it for weeks, sacrificing thousands of men without achieving anything. Zhukov studies the situation with the cold professional analysis that defines his approach to command. He concentrates artillery, brings in fresh divisions, and plans a methodical offensive using principles of overwhelming firepower rather than dramatic maneuver. On September 6th, he launches the attack. It succeeds, pushing German forces back 25 kilometers and eliminating the salient. The victory costs 31,000 Soviet casualties for terrain that has minimal strategic value, but the symbolic importance exceeds the tactical achievement. Yelnya is the first successful Soviet offensive of the war, proof that the Red Army can attack as well as defend, evidence that German invincibility is a myth. Soviet propaganda trumpets the victory as a turning point. Stalin, watching carefully, takes note. The catastrophe of June and July 1941 represents the natural consequence of Stalin's purges, his political paranoia, and his willful refusal to accept reality until reality imposed itself through artillery bombardment. The Red Army lost the approximately 2 million casualties in the first 2 months of war, a casualty rate that would break most military organizations permanently. But the Soviet Union is not a normal state, and the Red Army is not a normal military, built through revolutionary violence, maintained through systematic terror, and led by men like Zhukov, who understand that survival requires accepting any cost. The Soviet military system proves capable of absorbing losses that would destroy other armies. Zhukov emerges from the summer disaster with his reputation paradoxically enhanced. He predicted everything that happened. He argued for measures that would have prevented or mitigated the catastrophe. Stalin ignored him. Now Stalin needs him to fix the situation that Stalin's stupidity created. This dynamic, where Zhukov's competence makes him indispensable despite political unreliability, will define their relationship for the rest of the war. The peasant's son has survived another test. The next one is already approaching. On September 26th, Stalin calls Zhukov with a question that will determine whether the Soviet Union continues to exist. Can you save Moscow? August 10th, 1941. Georgy Zhukov stands in a muddy field near Yelnya, watching Soviet artillery pound German positions through binoculars that keep fogging in the humid August heat. The bombardment represents his first command of a significant operation, since being relieved as Chief of General Staff 2 weeks earlier. Around him, staff officers from Reserve Front Headquarters study maps and coordinate unit movements with the methodical efficiency that Zhukov demands from his subordinates. The Yelnya salient bulges into Soviet-held territory like a tumor, and Zhukov intends to cut it out using overwhelming artillery concentration, followed by infantry assault. There's nothing elegant about the plan, no brilliant maneuver or clever deception. It's industrial-scale violence applied with mathematical precision. 500 guns firing for 3 hours, creating a barrage that turns German defensive positions into moonscape, then waves of infantry advancing into the destruction. Zhukov knows this approach will cost thousands of Soviet lives. He orders the attack anyway because eliminating the salient matters more than the casualty count. The Yelnya offensive succeeds through sheer weight of firepower, pushing German forces back 25 kilometers over 10 days of continuous combat. Soviet casualties total 31,000 dead and wounded, approximately the same as German losses, which represents an unusual parity. Throughout June and July, Soviet operations typically suffered casualty ratios of 4 or 5 to 1 versus German forces. At Yelnya, Zhukov achieves roughly equal exchanges, partly through careful preparation, but mostly through accepting that killing Germans requires killing Russians in approximately equal numbers when you're attacking prepared defensive positions. The victory's real importance is psychological rather than tactical. Soviet propaganda transforms Yelnya into the first successful counteroffensive of the war. Evidence that German invincibility is propaganda rather than fact. Stalin reads the reports with particular attention. The general he dismissed in anger 3 weeks earlier has just handed him the only good news of the entire summer. Zhukov's phone rings on August 28th at midnight. Stalin's voice on the line asks a simple question. Can you leave immediately for Leningrad? The conversation that follows reveals Stalin's peculiar method of command during crises. He doesn't explain the situation in Leningrad or outline what he expects Zhukov to accomplish. He simply states that the city is surrounded, that the current commander, Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, is incompetent, and that Zhukov must fix the situation. The call lasts 90 minutes, an extraordinary length for Stalin, who typically issues orders tersely. Zhukov later claims the conversation covered strategic priorities, acceptable casualty levels, and political imperatives regarding Leningrad's symbolic importance. Reading between the lines of his carefully censored memoirs, the discussion was probably more direct. Stalin needed someone willing to make brutal decisions that Stalin himself wanted but couldn't publicly order. Holding Leningrad would require sacrificing thousands of soldiers and accepting that hundreds of thousands of civilians would starve during the inevitable siege. Voroshilov, an old Bolshevik with sentimental attachment to revolutionary principles, couldn't execute such a policy. Zhukov, unburdened by sentiment, could. September 13th, Zhukov arrives in Leningrad to find a disaster spiraling toward total collapse. German Army Group North has reached the southern suburbs, close enough that artillery shells land in the city center every few hours. The Finnish army has advanced from the north to the old 1940 border, completing the encirclement. 2.5 million civilians are trapped inside the city with food supplies sufficient for perhaps 35 days at current consumption rates. Voroshilov has tried to organize a defense but lacks the ruthlessness necessary for the situation. Soviet units retreat without orders when German pressure intensifies. Officers evacuate their families rather than maintaining positions. The headquarters staff spends more time planning their own escape routes than coordinating defensive operations. Zhukov walks into a command post in the city and finds Voroshilov staring at a wall map with the hopeless expression of a man who knows he's failed. Zhukov relieves him immediately, not even waiting for official authorization from Moscow. He gathers the staff officers and delivers a speech that clarifies the new regime. Anyone who retreats without orders will be shot. Any unit that abandons positions will see its commander executed. Any suggestion of evacuating the city will result in immediate arrest. Then he goes to Finland Station, the rail terminal in northern Leningrad, where some Soviet units are withdrawing in disorder, and personally shoots 3 officers for cowardice. The executions at Finland Station send exactly the message Zhukov intends. Leningrad's defense immediately stiffens as officers realize that retreating from German fire means facing Zhukov's firing squad, making holding positions marginally less suicidal than withdrawing. Zhukov implements a defense in depth, using the city's natural advantages. Leningrad is built on a river delta, with numerous waterways that channel attacking forces into predictable approaches. He fortifies every bridge, positions artillery to create interlocking fields of fire, and establishes multiple defensive lines so that penetrating one line merely exposes attackers to the next. The strategy isn't sophisticated, but sophistication isn't required. Leningrad's geography favors defenders if defenders are willing to accept casualties while holding ground. Zhukov is very willing to accept casualties. September the 17th, German forces launch a major assault on Leningrad's southern perimeter, attempting to break through into the city proper. The attack involves 2 panzer divisions and 6 infantry divisions, approximately 80,000 men supported by artillery and air bombardment. Soviet defenders, now terrified of Zhukov more than Germans, hold their positions even when German tanks penetrate defensive lines. The result is unprecedented urban combat, where Soviet infantry attacks German armor at close range using Molotov cocktails, anti-tank rifles, and suicidal determination. German tankers discover that city streets neutralize their mobility advantage while exposing them to infantry assault from buildings and basements. The offensive stalls after 3 days, having advanced less than 2 kilometers at a cost of 5,000 German casualties. Soviet losses are higher, approximately 9,000, but Zhukov considers the exchange acceptable. Leningrad remains in Soviet hands, and that's the only metric that matters. The city's real catastrophe isn't military, but logistical. Food supplies are depleting faster than rationing can mitigate, and there's no way to resupply the city except across Lake Ladoga using barges and boats, a route that German aircraft attack constantly. Zhukov understands with absolute clarity that holding Leningrad militarily means condemning hundreds of thousands of civilians to death by starvation. He makes this calculation explicitly in reports to Stalin, noting that military priorities require diverting all available transport to ammunition and military supplies rather than food. Stalin approves the priority system. Throughout September and into October, daily food rations drop steadily. Workers receive 800 grams of bread per day. Non-workers receive 400 grams. Children receive 300 grams. These rations are insufficient to sustain life, particularly as winter approaches and heating fuel disappears. Zhukov knows this. He also knows that military collapse would mean the entire population faces execution or enslavement by German forces. The choice is between allowing starvation and guaranteeing extermination. He chooses starvation without visible remorse. September 26th, Stalin calls Zhukov with another crisis requiring immediate response. The conversation, which Zhukov later records in fragmentary form, consists mainly of Stalin asking whether Zhukov can leave Leningrad immediately. Zhukov asks about the situation in the city he's supposed to be defending. Stalin says that Leningrad will hold or fall based on the defense structure Zhukov has established in the past 2 weeks. But Moscow is now under direct threat, and Stalin needs his most capable general there immediately. Zhukov protests that Leningrad requires continued attention, that the defense is still fragile, that leaving might encourage renewed German offensive operations. Stalin ends the discussion by simply ordering Zhukov to transfer command to Lieutenant General Ivan Fedyuninsky and report to Moscow within 24 hours. Zhukov complies because in Stalin's Soviet Union, compliance is the only option. He flies out of Leningrad on September 27th, leaving behind a city he's temporarily saved from military conquest, but that he knows will experience horrors exceeding combat. The siege of Leningrad will eventually kill approximately 1 million civilians through starvation and cold. Zhukov's defense made that siege possible by preventing German capture. Whether this represents success or moral catastrophe depends on your definition of acceptable costs. The pattern that emerges across Zhukov's August and September commands reveals Stalin's operational use of his most competent general. Zhukov is the firefighter, dispatched to crisis points with complete authority and the expectation that he'll stabilize situations through any means necessary. The pattern began at Yelnya, continued at Leningrad, and is about to repeat at Moscow. Each crisis follows the same template. Chaotic deterioration under previous commanders, Zhukov's arrival with full authority to execute anyone he considers incompetent or cowardly, rapid stabilization through brutal discipline and professional competence, then Zhukov's departure to the next crisis before he becomes politically threatening through sustained success in one location. This system exploits Zhukov's strengths while containing his political risk. He never commands one front long enough to build personal loyalty among troops or develop relationships that might enable a challenge to Stalin's authority. He's perpetually the outsider, arriving to fix disasters, then disappearing before becoming part of the established order. The emotional toll of this existence remains largely hidden because Zhukov's personality and the Soviet system's requirements both demand suppression of normal human responses. His marriage has effectively ended, destroyed by the combination of military demands and his own emotional unavailability. His daughters know him primarily as an occasionally present authority figure rather than a father. He forms no close friendships because friendship in Stalin's Soviet Union represents potential evidence of conspiracy. His entire social world consists of professional relationships calibrated for survival. Officers respect or fear him, but don't confide in him. Subordinates execute his orders without question, but wouldn't trust him with personal information. Stalin uses him as a tool, valued for effectiveness, but regarded as potentially dangerous. This isolation is partly self-imposed, protection against the purge mentality that still pervades Soviet institutions, but it's also the inevitable result of being simultaneously indispensable and expendable. September 28th, Zhukov boards the aircraft that will carry him from Leningrad to Moscow, without knowing exactly what situation he'll confront. German forces are approaching the capital, that much is clear from radio reports. But whether Moscow faces imminent assault or merely threatened encirclement remains unclear. The flight takes 3 hours, flying east over forests and swamps that stretch to the horizon. Below, he can see refugees on roads, columns of soldiers moving in both directions. The disorganized sprawl of an empire at war. Somewhere down there, German reconnaissance units are probably photographing these same roads, counting the trucks and soldiers, reporting back to their commanders about Soviet movements. The intelligence war is being lost as comprehensively as the shooting war. German signals intelligence intercepts Soviet radio traffic. German reconnaissance aircraft photograph Soviet positions. German spies report on industrial production and military deployments. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence, purged and politicized, produces reports that Stalin ignores when they contradict his preconceptions. The asymmetry creates situations where German commanders know more about Soviet dispositions than Soviet commanders know about their own forces. The aircraft descends toward Moscow's airport as afternoon fades to evening. Zhukov looks out the window at the city approaching. A sprawl of buildings and smoke, factories and churches, the center of Soviet power, and the target of Germany's entire Eastern campaign. 3 months ago, he was Chief of General Staff, responsible for planning operations across all fronts. Then he was relieved in disgrace for arguing with Stalin. Then he commanded Reserve Front at Yelnya. Then he saved Leningrad. Now he's being summoned to save Moscow. The promotion and demotion cycle, the constant testing and reassignment, creates perpetual instability that prevents him from building a power base while ensuring he remains professionally sharp through continuous crisis management. Whether Stalin designed this system consciously or it emerged naturally from his paranoia is impossible to determine. The effect is the same either way. Georgy Zhukov, age 44, survivor of poverty, World War, Revolution, Civil War, Purges, and 3 months of catastrophic military disaster, is about to face the ultimate test. Moscow must be held. Failure means Soviet defeat, and probably Zhukov's execution. Success might mean survival, at least temporarily. The peasant son adjusts his uniform, collects his maps and briefing documents, and prepares to meet Stalin. The real war, despite 3 months of combat, is only now beginning. October 6th, 1941. Georgy Zhukov spreads a map across the conference table in his new headquarters and confronts a situation that might charitably be called hopeless. He's been appointed commander of the Western Front 3 days ago with orders to defend Moscow against Operation Typhoon, Germany's final offensive to capture the Soviet capital before winter. The map tells a story of comprehensive disaster. German Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, has committed 1,800,000 soldiers, 1,700 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces, and 1,300 aircraft to this operation. Defending Moscow, Zhukov has approximately 90,000 combat-effective troops, 770 tanks scattered across multiple shattered units, and minimal air support, because the Luftwaffe has achieved nearly complete air superiority. The force ratio approaches 20-1 in Germany's favor at the main attack points. Any competent military analysis concludes that Moscow will fall within weeks, probably days. Zhukov studies the map and begins issuing orders that accept catastrophic casualties as the baseline assumption for any defensive plan. The strategic situation is actually worse than the raw numbers suggest. German forces have already achieved major breakthroughs at Vyazma and Bryansk, creating massive encirclements that trap approximately 600,000 Soviet soldiers. These pockets won't be eliminated quickly because surrounded Soviet units fight with desperate ferocity. But they're strategically irrelevant, removed from the battle for Moscow. Meanwhile, German panzer divisions are advancing on 3 axes toward the capital, moving faster than Soviet reserves can deploy to block them. The autumn weather has begun the period Russians call Rasputitsa, when dirt roads turn to mud that can swallow vehicles whole. But German forces are maintaining operational tempo through sheer determination and professional competence. The closest German units are approximately 70 kilometers from Moscow's outskirts. Zhukov calculates that without reinforcements, the city becomes indefensible within 10 days. With reinforcements, perhaps 3 weeks. He needs a miracle, or more precisely, he needs divisions that don't exist yet. October 15th and 16th mark Moscow's moment of maximum panic, when the Soviet government nearly loses control of its own capital. Stalin orders evacuation of most government ministries and foreign embassies to Kuibyshev, 800 kilometers east. The NKVD begins destroying archives and preparing demolitions to deny the Germans any useful infrastructure. Word spreads through the city that the leadership is abandoning Moscow. The result is panic that edges toward riot. Hundreds of thousands of Muscovites flood train stations demanding evacuation. Looting breaks out in the Arbat district as people decide that if Moscow is falling, personal property rights are meaningless. NKVD blocking detachments shoot looters in the streets, but the violence spreads faster than the security forces can suppress it. Zhukov watches this chaos while simultaneously trying to organize a coherent defense with resources that barely exist. At some point during these nightmare days, he seriously considers the tactical problem of fighting a battle for Moscow, street by street, building by building, accepting that the capital will be destroyed in the process, but perhaps buying time for reserves to arrive. Stalin summoned Zhukov on October 17th to ask the question that defines Soviet survival. They meet in Stalin's Kremlin office, just the two of them, no witnesses. Stalin asks with remarkable directness whether Moscow can be held. Zhukov responds that holding Moscow requires 2 things: time to bring Siberian divisions west, and Stalin's visible presence in the city to prevent panic from becoming complete collapse. Stalin's presence in Moscow is itself risky because German forces might capture the dictator if they break through the defensive lines, but Zhukov argues that evacuation would signal defeat and destroy whatever morale remains. Stalin listens, then asks the critical question, can you hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive? Zhukov answers yes. But the affirmative response comes with an implicit addendum that both men understand without speaking. Holding requires accepting casualties that will horrify anyone with normal human emotions. Stalin approves whatever Zhukov thinks necessary. The meeting ends. Stalin stays in Moscow. November 7th represents Stalin's strategic gamble that Zhukov's assessment is correct. Despite German forces approximately 70 kilometers away, despite regular artillery fire landing in Moscow's outskirts, Stalin insists on holding the traditional Revolution Day parade in Red Square. The symbolism is obvious. The Soviet Union continues to function normally despite the military crisis. But the parade isn't exactly normal. It's conducted under heavy clouds that prevent German airstrikes, with anti-aircraft batteries at maximum alert, and with parade participants carrying live ammunition. Troops marching through Red Square in formation are scheduled to board trucks immediately after the parade and deployed to defensive positions west of Moscow. Stalin delivers a speech from atop Lenin's mausoleum, his words broadcast across the Soviet Union, emphasizing historical Russian resistance to invaders and inevitable Soviet victory. Georgy Zhukov stands in the reviewing stand watching soldiers march past, calculating how many of them will be dead within weeks, wondering whether the reserves he's banking on will actually arrive in time. The reserves Zhukov desperately needs are traveling west from Siberia and the Far East, in one of history's great strategic redeployments. Stalin has made the enormous gamble that Japan, having attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th and declared war on the United States and Britain, will not simultaneously attack the Soviet Union in Siberia. This assessment derives from intelligence provided by Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Tokyo, who reported that Japan has decided to pursue a southern expansion strategy against Western colonial possessions, rather than a northern strategy against the USSR. Stalin has accepted Sorge's intelligence and ordered massive troop transfers westward. 17 rifle divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft are traveling the Trans-Siberian Railway toward Moscow. These forces represent the Soviet Union's strategic reserve, the last uncommitted units of significant combat capability. If they arrive too late, or if Japanese intelligence proves wrong and Japan attacks in the east, the Soviet Union loses the war. The trains carrying these units rumble west through November, racing against German panzer spearheads approaching Moscow from 3 directions. November 27th brings the closest German approach to Moscow, the moment when the city's fate balances on chaos and chance. German reconnaissance units of the 2nd Panzer Division reach Khimki, 15 kilometers from the Kremlin, close enough that officers with good binoculars can see Moscow's distinctive towers and spires. The unit commander sends a radio message reporting his position and requesting reinforcement to exploit the breakthrough. The message reaches Field Marshal von Bock's headquarters and triggers debate about whether to commit reserves. German commanders understand they're operating at the absolute limit of their logistics system. Fuel shortages are severe. The autumn mud has destroyed transport vehicles at horrifying rates. The temperature has dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius, freezing equipment designed for Western European conditions. German soldiers are fighting in summer uniforms because the winter clothing that was supposed to arrive hasn't appeared due to transportation chaos. Despite these problems, the temptation to push forward those final 15 kilometers and seize Moscow proves nearly irresistible. Bock orders reinforcements forward, but the reserves move slowly in the mud and cold, and Soviet resistance stiffens with frantic desperation. The Khimki penetration is contained, then pushed back. Moscow survives by the narrowest margin imaginable. December 5th, 1941, 3 o'clock in the morning. Zhukov stands in his command bunker west of Moscow, surrounded by maps covered with arrows and unit markers. The temperature outside is minus 40 degrees Celsius. German forces, frozen and exhausted, have stalled across the entire front. Their offensive momentum has finally broken against the combination of Soviet resistance, supply failure, and Russian winter. The Siberian divisions Zhukov counted on have been arriving for 2 weeks. 718,000 fresh troops wearing winter equipment, operating tanks designed for cold weather, and still possessed of offensive spirit because they haven't spent 3 months being mauled by German panzers. Zhukov has secretly concentrated these forces on the flanks of German salients, positioning them for a counteroffensive that will hit the Germans exactly where they're weakest. At 3 in the morning, he gives the order to attack. 25,000 guns open fire simultaneously across a front 600 kilometers wide. The sound can be heard in Moscow, a continuous thunder that signals the war's first major Soviet offensive operation. The Soviet counteroffensive at Moscow achieves strategic surprise despite being launched by 750,000 men. German intelligence has completely failed to detect the Siberian division's arrival, partly because Soviet deception operations created false radio traffic, suggesting these units remained in the Far East, partly because German reconnaissance capability has degraded severely in the winter conditions. When Soviet attacks begin on December 5th, German units holding frontline positions suddenly face fresh divisions supported by tanks and artillery that shouldn't exist according to German intelligence estimates. The psychological shock equals the tactical impact. German soldiers, told by their commanders that the Soviet Union is nearly defeated and Moscow's capture is imminent, discover that the enemy is actually launching major offensive operations. The German defensive response is hindered by the fact that their equipment is literally frozen. Tank engines won't start in minus 40-degree temperatures without prolonged heating. Vehicles that worked fine in October are now immobile hunks of frozen metal. German soldiers are frostbitten, exhausted, and increasingly demoralized as they are pushed back from positions they captured at terrible cost. The offensive's operational depth impresses even skeptical military professionals. By January 7, 1942, Soviet forces have pushed German Army Group Center back 100 to 250 kilometers, depending on the sector, eliminating the immediate threat to Moscow and liberating substantial territory. The advance covers roughly the same ground that German forces conquered in October and November, demonstrating that Soviet forces can now match German operational tempo under winter conditions. But the advance comes at extraordinary cost. 658,000 Soviet casualties, including 140,000 dead, versus 145,000 German casualties. The casualty ratio, approximately 4.5 Soviet losses for every German loss, reveals the brutal mathematics of Zhukov's operational style. He wins by accepting casualties that would cause other commanders to halt operations out of humanitarian concern or logistical necessity. Zhukov halts operations only when his forces are physically incapable of advancing further, which occurs in early January, when Soviet spearheads run out of supplies and momentum simultaneously. January 7, 1942. Stalin convenes a victory celebration at the Kremlin to commemorate the successful defense of Moscow. Zhukov attends wearing his new decorations and the carefully neutral expression he's perfected for dealing with Stalin. The dictator is triumphant, crediting the party's leadership and Soviet socialist system for the victory while mentioning military commanders almost as an afterthought. Zhukov stands silently during Stalin's speech, understanding that the politics of victory are as dangerous as the politics of defeat. A general who's too successful becomes threatening. A general who accepts too much credit becomes a target. The peasant's son who saved Moscow through operational competence and callous disregard for casualties knows better than to appear too pleased with the outcome. He's studied the fates of successful generals throughout Russian history. Most of them ended badly despite their victories. Survival requires minimizing visibility, even at moments of maximum achievement. The Moscow counteroffensive transforms the war's psychological dynamic without fundamentally changing the strategic situation. The Soviet Union has survived Operation Barbarossa's initial onslaught, prevented Moscow's capture, and demonstrated that German forces can be defeated through overwhelming numbers and acceptance of casualties. But the Red Army has lost approximately 4 million casualties in 6 months, a rate of attrition that would destroy most military establishments. German Army Group Center remains a coherent fighting force despite being pushed back, still capable of offensive operations when weather permits and supplies arrive. The war will continue for another 3.5 years, consuming millions more lives in battles that make Moscow seem modest by comparison. For Georgy Zhukov, Moscow represents vindication of his operational concepts and survival through Stalin's most dangerous period. He predicted German tactics accurately. He stabilized a collapsing situation through ruthless discipline, and he achieved victory through methods that prioritize winning over limiting friendly casualties. These characteristics will define every battle he commands for the rest of the war. The moral questions about whether such victories are worth their costs remain unanswered. Zhukov doesn't ask such questions. He's too busy preparing for the next crisis. And the next crisis is already forming 150 kilometers west, at a place called Purges. January 8, 1942. Georgy Zhukov stares at a map showing the Purges salient, a German-held bulge jutting into Soviet lines approximately 80 kilometers west of Moscow. The salient represents both a strategic threat and a psychological wound. German forces occupy this territory less than 2 hours' drive from the Soviet capital, a permanent reminder that Moscow's salvation remains incomplete. During the victory celebration yesterday, Stalin asked Zhukov a seemingly simple question: when will Soviet forces eliminate the Purges salient? Zhukov responded with his typical directness that eliminating the salient requires substantial forces and careful preparation. Stalin's response was equally direct. The salient will be eliminated immediately using forces currently available, because the Soviet Union cannot tolerate German forces so close to Moscow. The conversation ended with Zhukov receiving orders to plan and execute a major offensive operation with a timeline measured in days rather than weeks. He returns to his headquarters knowing that he's been ordered to achieve the impossible again, and that failure will have consequences that success at Moscow cannot mitigate. The Ruzhev salient exists because German Army Group Center established strong defensive positions during the Moscow counteroffensive's final phase. Rather than retreating in disorder, German forces conducted fighting withdrawals to prepared positions anchored on towns and villages that could be fortified. Ruzhev itself sits on high ground dominating the approaches from the east, making frontal assault extraordinarily costly. German defenders have spent December and early January fortifying these positions with professional thoroughness. Concrete bunkers, interconnected trenches, pre-registered artillery coordinates covering all approach routes, and minefields protecting every obvious avenue of attack. The German Ninth Army, commanded by General Walter Model, holds the salient with approximately 200,000 troops. They're cold, undersupplied, and still recovering from the Moscow offensive's shock, but they're positioned in terrain that favors defenders and commanded by an officer who understands defensive warfare better than almost anyone in the German military. Attacking these positions without overwhelming superiority in artillery and armor is military malpractice. Zhukov knows this. He orders the attack anyway because Stalin has commanded it. January 8th through February 4th represents the offensive's planning and initial execution phase, a period characterized by increasingly desperate attempts to overcome German defensive superiority through sheer weight of assault. Zhukov concentrates approximately 340,000 Soviet troops against the salient's northern and southern faces, intending a double envelopment that will trap German forces inside a pocket. The concept is sound in theory, replicating his successful operation at Khalkhin Gol 3 years earlier. But Khalkhin Gol involves surprise, overwhelming material superiority, and Japanese forces positioned in open terrain. Brezhnev involves none of these advantages. German commanders know the attack is coming because Soviet troop concentrations are impossible to hide. Material superiority is modest at best. The Moscow counteroffensive consumed enormous ammunition stocks that haven't been replenished. And the terrain is forested swamp frozen solid in January, but beginning to thaw in early February, creating mud that swallows vehicles and makes offensive maneuver nightmarish. Zhukov launches the offensive regardless, committing Soviet forces to frontal assaults against prepared German positions. February the 4th, Soviet 29th and 33rd Armies achieve a breakthrough south of Ruzhev, penetrating German defensive lines and advancing approximately 30 kilometers into German rear areas. For approximately 72 hours, the offensive appears to be succeeding. Zhukov orders the breakthrough forces to continue advancing, to maintain momentum regardless of casualties or supply difficulties, to exploit success before German reserves can seal the penetration. The trapped Soviet armies push west and north, attempting to link up with other Soviet forces and complete the encirclement of Ruzhev. They advance through forest and swamp, fighting German blocking forces, capturing small towns and villages, spreading out across a front that grows wider and thinner with each kilometer gained. Then German counterattacks begin, coordinated assaults by panzer divisions that Model has carefully positioned exactly for this contingency. The German response is professional and devastating. Within a week, the Soviet penetration has been isolated, surrounded, and is being systematically destroyed by German forces that now hold every advantage. February 15th, General Mikhail Yefremov, commanding the surrounded 33rd Army, radios Zhukov requesting permission to attempt a breakout. His forces are trapped approximately 40 kilometers behind German lines, cut off from supply, running low on ammunition and food. Approximately 26,000 Soviet soldiers are fighting in a shrinking pocket against German forces that grow stronger, as Model concentrates additional units for the annihilation operation. Yefremov's message is professionally phrased but desperate underneath the military language. His army is dying, and extraction is the only option that doesn't guarantee total destruction. Zhukov's response reveals everything about his command philosophy that needs revealing. He orders Yefremov to hold position, to continue attacking westward, to maintain pressure on German forces regardless of circumstances. The message explicitly forbids breakout attempts or retreat. Yefremov's army will stay in place and keep fighting because Zhukov has decided that their sacrifice serves operational purposes even if the soldiers themselves die without achieving anything beyond distracting German forces. The 33rd Army's destruction unfolds with slow horror through late February and March. German forces tighten the encirclement methodically, using artillery to pound Soviet positions while conserving their own infantry for final assaults. Soviet attempts to supply the pocket by air fail because the Luftwaffe maintains air superiority and Soviet transport aircraft are shot down with predictable regularity. The few aircraft that reach the pocket deliver ammunition rather than food because Zhukov's priorities emphasize offensive capability over survival. Soldiers inside the pocket begin starving while simultaneously being ordered to attack German positions. The combination of hunger, cold, ammunition shortages, and continuous German pressure breaks unit cohesion. By mid-March, the 33rd Army has ceased to exist as an organized fighting force, fragmenting into small groups that attempt breakouts on their own initiative. Most are killed or captured. Yefremov himself is wounded during a breakout attempt on March 19th and commits suicide rather than allow himself to be captured. His last radio message to Zhukov requests that his family be cared for. There's no record of Zhukov's response. March through April brings continued offensive operations around Rzhev, with results that vary between disappointing and catastrophic. Zhukov launches repeated attacks against the German salient's northern face using forces from the Khalkhin front, attempting to achieve through persistence what couldn't be achieved through initial assault. Each attack follows the same pattern. Soviet infantry advances against German defensive positions, comes under devastating artillery and machine gun fire, takes heavy casualties, captures perhaps a few kilometers of territory, then gets pushed back by German counterattacks. The casualty figures accumulate with mathematical precision. 30,000 here, 45,000 there, another 20,000 in the next operation. By April 20th, when Stalin finally orders operations suspended, Soviet losses around Rzhev total 776,000 dead and 575,000 wounded. Total Soviet casualties, 1,342,888. German casualties during the same period, approximately 145,000. The casualty ratio, nearly 10 to 1 in Germany's favor, represents the worst Soviet performance of the entire war. The Rzhev disaster remains largely unknown outside specialist military circles because Soviet authorities successfully suppressed information about it for nearly 5 decades. Wartime reporting mentioned only heavy fighting near Rzhev without providing casualty figures or acknowledging the operational failure. Post-war Soviet military histories devoted minimal space to the Rzhev operations, treating them as minor tactical engagements rather than major offensive operations. Zhukov's own memoirs, published in 1969, allocate 3 pages to the Rzhev battles versus more than 40 pages discussing Moscow and Stalingrad. The sections discussing Rzhev avoid mentioning specific casualty figures or acknowledging that the operations achieved essentially nothing beyond killing enormous numbers of Soviet soldiers. This censorship wasn't merely political embarrassment. It reflected the Soviet system's fundamental approach to military operations. Casualties are acceptable if they serve strategic purposes, and discussing casualties serves no strategic purpose. Therefore, discussing casualties is pointless or actively harmful to maintaining morale and international prestige. The operational lessons from Rzhev are clear to anyone willing to see them, though whether Zhukov actually internalized these lessons remains debatable. Frontal attacks against prepared defensive positions without overwhelming artillery. Superiority achieved nothing except creating casualties. Maintaining offensive pressure after initial momentum is lost, compounds failures rather than reversing them. Refusing to extract surrounded forces because their sacrifice might distract enemy attention wastes soldiers' lives without achieving proportional gains. Accepting 10-to-1 casualty ratios suggests fundamental operational incompetence or callous disregard for soldiers' survival. Any objective analysis of the Ruzhbev operations concludes that Zhukov committed serious military mistakes, driven by political pressure to achieve rapid success and personal unwillingness to tell Stalin that an operation was impossible. These are exactly the mistakes that less competent commanders made during Operation Barbarossa's opening weeks. The difference is that those commanders were relieved or executed for failure. Zhukov survives because Stalin needs him despite Ruzhev, and because Ruzhev's disasters remain hidden from public knowledge. April 1942. The spring Rasputitsa turns the terrain around Ruzhev into an ocean of mud that makes further offensive operations physically impossible. Stalin orders Zhukov to suspend attacks and prepare defensive positions for the anticipated German summer offensive. The directive implicitly acknowledges that 4 months of operations around Ruzhev have achieved nothing except consuming irreplaceable resources that will be desperately needed elsewhere. Zhukov accepts the order without apparent concern about the million-plus casualties his operations have incurred. His reports to Stalin emphasize that Soviet attacks have forced Germany to maintain substantial forces in the Ruzhev salient, forces that might otherwise have been used offensively against Moscow or in southern operations. This argument has some validity. German forces around Ruzhev were indeed pinned down defending the salient. But the strategic value of pinning down 200,000 Germans by sacrificing 1,300,000 Soviets suggests mathematics that only makes sense if you consider Soviet soldiers' infinitely replaceable resources rather than human beings. The Ruzhev meat grinder reveals Zhukov at his worst, operationally inflexible, humanly callous, and politically servile, despite his reputation for standing up to Stalin. The operations demonstrate that his genius, such as it is, lies in coordination and logistics rather than operational art or tactical innovation. When he has overwhelming resources and can win through material superiority, he's extraordinarily effective. When forced to achieve victory through clever maneuver or efficient use of limited forces, he fails catastrophically. This pattern will repeat throughout his career. His successful operations from Stalingrad onward all share a common characteristic: massive Soviet numerical and material superiority applied with brutal persistence. His failures at Ruzhev and later at Silo Heights during the Berlin operation share equally common characteristics: attacking strong defensive positions without sufficient superiority, accepting horrific casualties to maintain operational tempo, and refusing to acknowledge when operations should be suspended rather than persisted with. Whether Stalin was correct in keeping Zhukov in command despite these failures depends on whether you consider the alternatives. The Soviet military system had very few generals who combined operational competence with political reliability. Zhukov, for all his flaws, delivered victories when they were desperately needed. The price of those victories, measured in millions of casualties, was apparently considered acceptable by a regime built on terror and maintained through mass death. The peasant's son who survived the Purges by demonstrating ruthlessness has now demonstrated that ruthlessness extends to his own soldiers. Ruzhev should have ended his career. Instead, it's barely a footnote in his legend. History written by survivors forgot the million dead at Ruzhev, but the dead remember. August 27, 1942. Georgy Zhukov stands in the Kremlin, receiving an appointment that makes him the second most powerful military figure in the Soviet Union. Stalin has just named him Deputy Supreme Commander, a newly created position that places Zhukov immediately below Stalin himself in the military hierarchy. The promotion comes as German forces are approaching Stalingrad, threatening to cut the Volga River and split the Soviet Union's southern front, while simultaneously advancing into the Caucasus toward the oil fields at Baku. The strategic situation is desperate enough that Stalin needs his most capable general positioned to coordinate responses across multiple fronts rather than commanding a single sector. Zhukov accepts the promotion, understanding that it represents both maximum authority and maximum vulnerability. If the southern operations fail, if Stalingrad falls and the Caucasus is lost, Stalin will need someone to blame. The Deputy Supreme Commander provides a conveniently positioned scapegoat, but Zhukov also understands something that Stalin doesn't yet fully grasp. The German advance into Stalingrad represents an opportunity rather than just a threat. The Germans are overextending themselves, creating vulnerabilities that a properly executed counterstroke could exploit catastrophically. September 12th, Zhukov arrives in Stalingrad, accompanied by Colonel General Alexander Vasilevsky, the Chief of General Staff. They've flown from Moscow to see the situation personally, to assess whether the city can be held and what forces will be required. The city is burning, vast sections reduced to rubble by German bombing and artillery. Soviet 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Zhukov, holds approximately 10% of the city in a perimeter that shrinks daily under German pressure. Zhukov meets them at a command bunker near the Volga River bank and describes the desperate fighting with professional precision. His army is being ground down in urban combat, losing hundreds of men daily, surviving only because the Volga River at their backs provides a supply line that German forces haven't completely severed. Zhukov expects orders to either evacuate or prepare for annihilation. Instead, Zhukov and Vasilevsky walk to a ruined building overlooking German positions and spend 30 minutes studying the enemy deployment through binoculars. Then, Zhukov turns to Vasilevsky and whispers something that Vasilevsky later records in his memoirs. This is a trap for the Germans. The statement seems insane, given that Soviet forces in Stalingrad are nearly destroyed, and German forces are clearly winning the immediate tactical battle. But Zhukov has recognized something that German commanders haven't. The battle for Stalingrad is consuming German operational reserves, while the flanks of the German advance are held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies that are substantially weaker than German formations. If Soviet forces can hold Stalingrad long enough to fix German attention on the urban fighting, then massive counteroffensives against the weak Romanian sectors could encircle the entire German Sixth Army inside the city. The plan requires accepting that Zhukov's 62nd Army will take catastrophic casualties while serving as bait, but Zhukov has already demonstrated at Ruzhev that he's perfectly willing to sacrifice enormous numbers of Soviet soldiers to achieve operational objectives. The Stalingrad plan is Ruzhev reversed. Instead of Soviet forces attacking into German defenses and dying pointlessly, Soviet forces will defend in urban terrain, where German advantages in mobility and coordination are neutralized, then launch the real attack elsewhere. September 13th, Zhukov returns to Moscow and presents an outline of Operation Uranus to Stalin. The operation's concept is elegant in its simplicity. Reinforce Stalingrad sufficiently to prevent complete German victory, while secretly assembling massive strike forces north and south of the city. Then launch simultaneous attacks against Romanian positions with the objective of encircling German forces inside Stalingrad. Stalin is skeptical, pointing out that reinforcing Stalingrad requires committing reserves that could be used offensively elsewhere. Zhukov argues that letting Stalingrad fall would free German forces for further advances while holding the city, fixes German operational attention. More importantly, encircling and destroying the German Sixth Army would eliminate Hitler's best defensive formation in southern Russia, fundamentally changing the strategic balance. Stalin asks the critical question, can Stalingrad actually be held long enough to prepare the counteroffensive? Zhukov's response is characteristically blunt. If Zhukov is given minimum necessary reinforcements and understands that no evacuation will be permitted regardless of casualties, yes, Stalingrad can hold for 2 to 3 months. Stalin approves the concept and authorizes planning to proceed in absolute secrecy. The next 2 months represent perhaps the most sophisticated deception operation in military history to that point. Soviet forces conduct a massive buildup of men and material north and south of Stalingrad, while convincing German intelligence that no major counteroffensive is being prepared. The deception involves multiple coordinated elements. Soviet radio traffic continues normal patterns, avoiding any increase that might indicate major troop movements. Units being moved to the Stalingrad area travel at night and hide during day to avoid German aerial reconnaissance. Dummy radio networks are activated in areas far from Stalingrad, simulating major force concentrations that draw German attention elsewhere. Soviet agents spread misinformation, suggesting that Soviet offensive priorities lie in the Moscow or Leningrad sectors. Meanwhile, the actual buildup proceeds with mechanical precision. 1 million troops, 13,451 guns, 1,463 tanks, 1,115 aircraft, concentrated within striking distance of Romanian defensive positions that German intelligence estimates are secure. German intelligence failure regarding Operation Uranus represents one of the war's great mysteries. Fremde Heere Ost, the German military intelligence organization responsible for assessing Soviet capabilities, estimates in early November that Soviet strategic reserves are positioned approximately 500 kilometers east of Stalingrad, too distant to effect immediate operations. The actual Soviet strike forces are positioned within 50 kilometers of their jump-off positions. This catastrophic intelligence failure results from multiple factors: German racial prejudice leading to systematic underestimation of Soviet capabilities, effective Soviet deception operations, and German commanders' focus on the tactical battle in Stalingrad, preventing attention to operational-level threats. German officers in Stalingrad are consumed with the immediate problem of destroying the last Soviet defenders in the city ruins. Nobody is seriously considering the possibility that the Soviets are preparing a major encirclement operation using forces that supposedly don't exist. The Germans are about to learn a lesson that military professionals teach using Stalingrad as the case study. Never become so fixated on tactical objectives that you ignore operational vulnerabilities. November 19th, 1942, 7:30 in the morning. 3,500 Soviet guns open fire simultaneously north of Stalingrad, beginning an artillery bombardment that targets Romanian Third Army positions across a 30-kilometer front. The Romanian soldiers, holding defensive lines in open steppe with minimal fortification, experience concentrated artillery fire that destroys communication systems, obliterates command posts, and creates casualties so severe that unit cohesion collapses within the first hour. At 8:50, Soviet tank and infantry forces emerge from the artillery smoke and begin advancing through Romanian positions. The Romanians, equipped with inferior weapons and trained for defensive rather than mobile warfare, cannot stop Soviet armor supported by overwhelming artillery. By noon, Soviet forces have penetrated Romanian defenses to depths of 15 to 20 kilometers. Romanian units are retreating in disorder or surrendering en masse. German reserves are alerted and begin moving toward the breakthrough, but the response is too slow and too weak. Zhukov has calculated the timing precisely. German operational reserves are committed inside Stalingrad, or positioned to defend against threats from the east, not attacks from the flanks. By evening, Soviet mobile groups have advanced 70 kilometers, effectively destroying Romanian Third Army as a coherent force. November 20th brings the Southern Pincers assault, a mirror image of the northern attack targeting Romanian Fourth Army positions south of Stalingrad. The pattern repeats with mechanical precision: massive artillery bombardment, breakthrough by Soviet armor, collapse of Romanian defenses, deep penetration into German rear areas. German commanders at Army Group headquarters finally recognize that they're facing coordinated encirclement operations rather than local Soviet attacks. Emergency orders go out recalling German forces from their positions inside Stalingrad, attempting to establish blocking positions against the Soviet pincers. But the orders arrive too late. Soviet mobile groups are already operating in areas that were supposedly secure German rear areas 12 hours earlier, overrunning supply depots, capturing bridges, and cutting communication lines. The speed of the Soviet advance shocks German commanders who remember their own blitzkrieg operations in 1941 and realize they're experiencing the same operational paralysis they once inflicted on Soviet forces. November 23rd, approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. Soviet forces from the northern and southern pincers meet near the town of Khalkhin, approximately 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The encirclement is complete. Trapped inside the pocket are approximately 290,000 German and Romanian soldiers, including the entire German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus. Zhukov receives radio confirmation of the link-up, while at Stavka headquarters in Moscow. He informs Stalin, who initially doesn't believe the report, insisting that verification is required because the achievement seems too good to be true. Within hours, aerial reconnaissance confirms the encirclement. Stalin authorizes a Stavka directive designating the pocket as a priority target for destruction. Zhukov immediately begins planning the next phase, preventing German relief attempts while systematically destroying the encircled forces. The Stalingrad encirclement represents Zhukov's masterpiece of operational planning, demonstrating everything he's learned from Khalkhin Gol about double envelopments and from Ruzhev about the futility of frontal attacks. At Stalingrad, he's applied the correct operational method. Fix enemy attention through defensive battle in one location, while preparing decisive offensive strokes elsewhere. Strike at enemy weak points rather than attacking strength. Maintain operational surprise through deception and rapid execution. Then exploit success ruthlessly without concern for casualties or flank security. The operation's success vindicates every controversial decision Zhukov made, insisting that Zhukov hold Stalingrad despite catastrophic casualties, accepting that Soviet forces in the city would be ground down to near nothing while the real offensive was prepared elsewhere, gambling that Romanian defensive sectors were vulnerable enough to achieve rapid breakthroughs. All of these decisions were correct, and collectively they have produced the most significant German defeat of the war to this point. December 1942 brings German relief attempts that Zhukov anticipated and prepared for. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably Germany's most capable commander, assembles a relief force and attacks towards Stalingrad from the southwest. Operation Winter Storm comes within 48 kilometers of the encircled Sixth Army, before Soviet counterattacks stop it. Zhukov has positioned substantial reserves specifically to block relief attempts, and these forces prove sufficient to prevent Manstein from reaching Paulus. Inside the pocket, German forces are running low on supplies despite Luftwaffe attempts to provide aerial resupply. The airlift is failing because Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and fighter aircraft are shooting down German transport planes at rates that make sustained supply impossible. By late December, it's clear that the encircled Sixth Army will be destroyed through starvation and attrition if it doesn't break out immediately. Hitler forbids breakout, ordering Paulus to hold Stalingrad regardless of circumstances. This decision effectively dooms 290,000 German soldiers to death or captivity. Zhukov, monitoring the situation, understands that the operation has succeeded beyond initial expectations. The Germans have lost not just a battle, but an entire army. January 1943 brings the final destruction of German forces at Stalingrad, an operation that Zhukov coordinates but doesn't personally command, having been reassigned to plan other offensive operations. The encircled Germans resist for nearly 2 more months, fighting with desperate courage in increasingly hopeless circumstances. When Paulus finally surrenders on February 2, 1943, approximately 91,000 German soldiers enter Soviet captivity. The remainder, approximately 200,000 men, have died from combat, starvation, or cold. The Stalingrad victory transforms the war's momentum and makes Zhukov the Soviet Union's most celebrated military commander despite his careful efforts to avoid personal publicity. Soviet propaganda trumpets Stalingrad as proof of inevitable Soviet victory and socialist system superiority. Western media identifies Zhukov as the architect of the victory, though he shares credit with Vasilevsky and the front commanders who executed the operation. Stalin, watching Zhukov's rising fame with characteristic paranoia, begins planning how to prevent his most successful general from becoming politically threatening. But that's a problem for later. For now, the Soviet Union has won its first great strategic victory, and Georgy Zhukov, the peasant's son, has proven himself a master of operational warfare. The question of whether his mastery depends on having overwhelming numerical superiority remains unexamined. Stalingrad's success has obscured Ruzhev's failures. History remembers victories. The dead at Ruzhev remain forgotten. March 8, 1943. Georgy Zhukov sits in a Stavka conference room examining intelligence documents that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Complete operational plans for Germany's next major offensive. The documents arrive from multiple sources, including the Lucy spy ring operating in Switzerland, which has provided extraordinarily detailed information about German military planning throughout the war. The specific operation detailed in these reports is codenamed Citadel, a massive offensive targeting the Kursk salient, a bulge in Soviet lines approximately 200 kilometers wide and 120 kilometers deep. German plans call for simultaneous attacks from north and south to pinch off the salient, encircle and destroy Soviet forces inside, then exploit success to regain operational initiative in the east. What makes these intelligence reports remarkable isn't just their detail, but their timing. Zhukov is reading German operational plans 3 months before the actual attack. The intelligence includes unit designations, attack axes, approximate dates, and even specific commanders. This level of intelligence penetration should provide overwhelming defensive advantage. But Stalin, reading the same reports, doesn't immediately accept Zhukov's recommendation to prepare defensive operations. Stalin wants to attack first. The strategic debate that unfolds in March and April 1943 reveals competing visions of Soviet operational art. Stalin, emboldened by Stalingrad's success, believes the Soviet Union should maintain offensive pressure, launching preemptive attacks before Germany can organize its Citadel operation. Several Stavka members support this view, arguing that initiative should be seized rather than surrendered. Zhukov argues the opposite position with unusual vehemence, pointing out that German citadel preparations indicate concentration of armor and elite formations that would be extraordinarily costly to attack frontally. Instead, Zhukov proposes deliberately absorbing the German offensive in prepared defensive positions, grinding down German armored strength through attrition, then launching Soviet counteroffensives when German forces are exhausted and disorganized. This approach, he argues, maximizes Soviet advantages in manpower and industrial production while minimizing casualties by forcing Germans to attack Soviet defensive positions rather than the reverse. The debate extends over multiple meetings, with Zhukov threatening resignation if forced to execute offensive operations he considers strategically stupid. Eventually, Stalin accepts Zhukov's position, partly because the intelligence is simply too good to ignore, and partly because Stalingrad's success has given Zhukov credibility that even Stalin must respect. April through June brings preparation that transforms the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified position in military history. Zhukov coordinates defensive works across multiple fronts, applying systematic principles developed from analyzing German defensive successes at Rzhev and elsewhere. The defensive system consists of 6 successive defensive belts extending to depths of approximately 120 kilometers. Each belt includes anti-tank ditches, minefields, interconnected trenches, concrete bunkers, and pre-positioned artillery. The scale is staggering. Soviet forces lay approximately 400,000 mines, an average of 2,500 mines per kilometer of front. 20,000 artillery pieces are positioned in the carefully surveyed positions, allowing pre-registered fire on predictable German approach routes. Tank traps are excavated across every likely armor avenue of advance. Zhukov's concept is elastic defense, deliberately allowing German forces to penetrate initial defensive lines into killing zones, where successive defensive positions can engage them from multiple directions, while artillery concentrates on destroying follow-on formations. The defensive preparations also include massive force concentration that exceeds anything Soviet forces have previously achieved. By late June, Soviet forces at Kursk number approximately 2,700,000 troops, 5,100 tanks, and 5,300 aircraft. This concentration represents the first time in the war that Soviet forces hold clear numerical superiority in armor rather than just infantry. The psychological impact of this superiority on Soviet commanders is subtle but significant. For the first time, They're not planning operations based on throwing infantry masses against German tanks and hoping superior numbers compensate for inferior equipment. Soviet tank forces at Kursk are numerically superior and, while still not matching German tanks qualitatively, sufficiently capable that they can engage German armor with reasonable expectation of success. This parity in armored warfare capability, combined with defensive positions that negate German mobility advantages, creates conditions where Soviet operational planning can focus on destroying German forces rather than merely surviving German attacks. May brings intelligence that should have caused Germany to cancel Operation Citadel entirely. The spy known as Werther, operating inside German high command, provides specific information indicating that Soviet forces are fully prepared for the attack and have fortified the Kursk salient extensively. German commanders receive reports from reconnaissance units confirming that Soviet defensive preparations are far more extensive than anticipated. Hitler personally delays the operation multiple times, partly because intelligence suggests that surprise has been lost, partly because he wants to wait for newer tank models to be delivered. Each delay allows Soviet forces additional time to strengthen defenses and concentrate forces. The delays also create strategic paralysis in German planning. The longer Citadel is postponed, the more Soviet forces strengthen their positions, but canceling the operation entirely would surrender initiative permanently. By late June, German commanders understand they're attacking into a fully prepared defense, but the operation has acquired political momentum that military logic cannot overcome. Hitler has publicly committed to Citadel as Germany's response to Stalingrad. Canceling would acknowledge that Germany can no longer conduct major offensive operations in the east. July 5, 1943, 2:20 in the morning. Zhukov, monitoring intelligence reports at Voronezh Front Headquarters, receives confirmation that German attack preparations are entering final phase. German artillery units have moved into forward positions. Assault divisions are in jump-off positions. Attack timing is estimated at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning. Zhukov makes a decision that demonstrates remarkable confidence in his intelligence. He orders a preemptive Soviet artillery bombardment targeting German assembly areas. At 2:40, 600 Soviet guns opened fire on German positions, catching German units in the final preparation stages before their own artillery bombardment was scheduled to begin. The bombardment causes confusion and some casualties among German forward units, but more importantly, it signals to German commanders that Soviet forces have precise intelligence about attack timing. The psychological impact equals the tactical effect. German officers launch their offensive knowing that surprise has been completely lost, and that they're attacking into defenses that are fully alert and prepared. The Battle of Kursk unfolds over 2 weeks with a mechanical brutality that reduces war to industrial process. German armored spearheads advance into Soviet defensive zones, engage massive minefields that channel their advance into killing zones, come under concentrated anti-tank and artillery fire that destroys vehicles faster than breakthroughs can be exploited, and gradually lose offensive momentum as casualties accumulate. Soviet defenders implement elastic defense doctrine, allowing German forces to penetrate forward defensive belts while preparing counterattacks using reserve tank formations, positioned behind the front lines. The battle's critical engagement occurs on July 12th near Prokhorovka, where approximately 800 Soviet tanks engage 700 German tanks in the largest armored engagement in history. The battle is tactically chaotic, with tanks fighting at close range in confused melee combat that negates German advantages in optics and gunnery. Soviet tanks, which perform poorly in long-range engagements, prove reasonably effective in close combat where armor thickness and gun power matter more than sophisticated fire control. The engagement ends without clear tactical victor, but achieves Zhukov's strategic objective. German armored formations have been attrited to the point where continuing offensive operations becomes impossible. July 13th brings Hitler's decision to suspend Operation Citadel, effectively acknowledging German failure. The decision results partly from Kursk's obvious lack of progress, but more significantly from Allied landings in Sicily on July 10th, creating a crisis in the Mediterranean that requires transferring German forces from the Eastern Front. Zhukov, monitoring intelligence reports about Hitler's decision, immediately orders Soviet counteroffensive operations to begin. The counteroffensives, planned months in advance, target German positions around Orel north of Kursk and Kharkov to the south. Soviet forces, having successfully defended against German attacks, now transition to offense using procedures that Zhukov has systematically refined. Massive artillery preparation, coordinated armor and infantry attacks against selected breakthrough points, rapid exploitation of success by mobile groups, then systematic expansion of penetrations. The operations succeed in driving German forces back approximately 150 to 200 kilometers over the next 6 weeks, liberating substantial territory and destroying significant German combat power. August 5, 1943, marks the liberation of Belgorod and Orel, triggering Moscow's first wartime artillery salute, a tradition that will continue for every subsequent major Soviet victory. Zhukov attends the Kremlin ceremony, where Stalin announces the victories and outlines plans for continued offensive operations. The strategic situation has fundamentally shifted. Prior to Kursk, Germany retained the capacity to launch major offensive operations that threatened Soviet survival. After Kursk, German forces are reduced to defensive operations, attempting to slow Soviet advances rather than reverse them. The mathematical explanation is straightforward. Germany has lost approximately 500,000 casualties in the Kursk operation and subsequent Soviet offensives, including irreplaceable losses in armor and experienced personnel. Soviet casualties are higher in absolute terms, approximately 860,000, but the Soviet Union's superior manpower reserves and industrial production make these losses replaceable in ways that German losses are not. The war's operational dynamic has permanently changed from question of whether Soviet Union will survive to question of how quickly Germany will be defeated. Zhukov's performance at Kursk represents his operational maturity, demonstrating that he's finally learned to balance aggression with patience. Unlike Ruzhev, where he launched attacks against prepared defenses and accepted catastrophic casualties for minimal gains, at Kursk, he deliberately chose to defend first, allowing the enemy to exhaust themselves attacking his positions, then transitioning to offense when circumstances favored Soviet operations. This approach maximizes the Soviet Union's advantages in manpower and material, while minimizing the impact of German advantages in tactical proficiency and equipment quality. The lesson seems obvious in retrospect, but it took Zhukov 2 years of combat experience and millions of casualties to learn it. Whether this learning curve represents acceptable costs depends entirely on your perspective. From Stalin's viewpoint, Zhukov's evolution from the commander who squandered 1 million lives at Rzhev to the commander who designed the Kursk defense represents satisfactory professional development purchased at necessary price. From the perspective of the 1 million dead at Rzhev, the learning curve seems unnecessarily expensive. September 1943. Zhukov receives notification that he's been promoted to Marshal of the Soviet Union, the military's highest rank. The promotion recognizes Kursk's success and acknowledges his position as the Soviet Union's preeminent military commander. But Zhukov understands that the promotion also represents danger. Stalin fears successful generals, particularly those who receive public acclaim. The NKVD maintains constant surveillance on all senior military figures, monitoring their correspondence, recording their conversations, and reporting any statements that might indicate excessive ambition or insufficient loyalty to Stalin personally. Zhukov governs his behavior accordingly, refusing interviews with foreign journalists, deflecting credit to party leadership and Stalin specifically, maintaining the careful political performance that survival requires. He's survived purges, catastrophic defeats, and now major victories. The victories, paradoxically, may be more dangerous than the defeats. A failed general is politically harmless. A successful general is potentially threatening. The peasant's son who's mastered operational warfare must now master the equally complex challenge of remaining indispensable while appearing unthreatening. The next 2 years will determine whether he succeeds at both. Because the Red Army is now advancing west toward Germany itself, and someone will need to command the final assault on Berlin. Whether that someone is Georgy Zhukov depends on whether he can navigate Stalin's paranoia without triggering the purges that consume so many other successful Soviet figures. The war against Germany continues, but Zhukov's war for survival never ends. August 23, 1943. Georgy Zhukov stands on a hill overlooking Kharkov, watching Soviet tanks roll through streets that have changed hands 4 times in 2 years of war. The city is burning again, vast sections reduced to rubble by the latest round of combat, but this time the Soviet advance won't be reversed by German counterattacks. The recapture of Kharkov represents more than just another city liberated. It marks the beginning of a systematic offensive campaign that will push German forces back across 2,000 kilometers of front over the next 9 months. Zhukov has been appointed to coordinate operations across multiple fronts, essentially functioning as Stalin's operational executive for the entire southern and central sectors. The role gives him unprecedented authority to shift reserves between fronts, prioritize objectives, and dictate operational tempo. It also makes him responsible for an offensive campaign that will consume millions of Soviet casualties while advancing westward at rates that sometimes exceed 10 kilometers per day. The scale of what's about to unfold dwarfs anything previously attempted in modern warfare. Zhukov studies the burning city below and calculates logistics requirements for maintaining offensive operations across fronts that stretch wider than the distance from Paris to Moscow. The operational concept Zhukov implements during autumn 1943 is called rolling offensive in Soviet military doctrine, though the phrase makes it sound more sophisticated than it actually is. The concept is simple: launch a major offensive operation on one sector of the front, forcing German reserves to concentrate against that threat, then immediately launch another offensive on a different sector before German forces can reposition. Repeat this process continuously across a 2,000-kilometer front so that German commanders never achieve stable defensive lines or accumulate sufficient reserves anywhere. The execution requires extraordinary logistics and coordination because each offensive consumes enormous ammunition stocks, requires fresh divisions to replace units ground down in previous operations, and demands constant railway traffic moving supplies westward as the front advances. Soviet railways, operating on different gauge track than European railways, require constant conversion work to maintain supply lines. Zhukov coordinates this chaos through a staff system that operates around the clock, tracking unit positions, ammunition stocks, replacement flows, and enemy dispositions across fronts that cover more territory than Western Europe. September 25 brings the liberation of Smolensk, a city that German forces have held since July 1941. The operation demonstrates Zhukov's systematic approach. 4 Soviet fronts attack simultaneously across a 400-kilometer sector, achieving multiple breakthroughs that prevent German forces from concentrating against any single threat. Soviet casualties in the Smolensk operation total approximately 250,000 versus approximately 80,000 German casualties, maintaining the roughly 3-to-1 casualty ratio that characterizes Soviet operations even during successful offensives. These ratios trouble Western military observers who study Soviet operations from London and Washington, wondering whether any nation can sustain such losses even while winning. But Soviet operational planning treats casualties as an acceptable cost of maintaining offensive pressure. Zhukov's reports to Stalin mention casualties in abstract statistical terms without dwelling on humanitarian implications. 300,000 casualties represent 300,000 spaces to be filled by new conscripts from training centers in the Urals and Siberia. The industrial approach to warfare, treating soldiers as replaceable components in a military machine, enables offensive operations that would be politically impossible in democratic societies. October brings a critical strategic decision that shapes the rest of the war. Stalin orders Zhukov to coordinate the liberation of Ukraine and the drive toward the Dnieper River. The Dnieper represents a major geographical obstacle, approximately 400 meters wide in places, that German forces intend to use as a defensive barrier, allowing them to stabilize the front. German engineers are demolishing bridges, establishing defensive positions on the river's west bank, and preparing to defend a line they believe can be held through winter. Zhukov's assessment, delivered to Stalin during a Stavka meeting on October 6th, is characteristically blunt. Soviet forces must force Dnieper crossings immediately before German defenses solidify, accepting that river assault operations will produce heavy casualties, but that allowing Germans time to fortify will produce even higher casualties later. Stalin approves aggressive crossing operations despite protests from some front commanders who argue that waiting for proper preparation would save lives. Zhukov overrules these objections, ordering crossing operations to begin using whatever equipment and boats are available, rather than waiting for specialized river crossing units. The Dnieper crossing operations, conducted throughout October and November, exemplify Soviet operational style at its most brutal and effective. Soviet infantry units assault across the river using improvised boats, rafts, and whatever floats. German defensive fire from the West Bank creates catastrophic casualties among the first waves, but subsequent waves continue crossing because orders allow no alternative. Soviet commanders implement a grim calculation. Each wave that reaches the West Bank, even if mostly destroyed, establishing a foothold, makes subsequent crossings marginally less costly. By mid-November, Soviet forces have established approximately 20 bridgeheads on the Dnieper's West Bank, several large enough to support armor and artillery. The cost is staggering, approximately 400,000 Soviet casualties in the Dnieper operations. But the strategic achievement matches the cost. German forces have been denied the stable defensive line they desperately needed, and Soviet forces have maintained westward momentum. Zhukov's operational logic, ruthless but militarily sound, holds that momentum is worth any casualty cost, because losing momentum allows enemy forces to recover and reorganize. January 1944 brings operations that many military analysts considered impossible, major offensive operations during winter conditions in northern Russia. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, which Zhukov coordinates across multiple fronts, attacks German forces besieging Leningrad with the objective of finally ending the siege that's killed approximately 1 million civilians. Soviet forces achieve complete surprise because German commanders assumed that winter conditions, with temperatures reaching minus 30 degrees Celsius and snow depths exceeding 1 meter, would prevent large-scale operations. Soviet units, equipped for winter warfare and supported by ski battalions that can move across snowfields, break through German positions and advance approximately 250 kilometers in 3 weeks. The offensive lifts the Leningrad siege on January 27, 1944, after 900 days. Soviet casualties in the operation total approximately 300,000. German casualties are approximately 150,000. The casualty ratios have improved slightly from 1941 levels, but remain heavily weighted against Soviet forces. The improvement reflects better Soviet tactical proficiency and coordination, rather than any reduced willingness to accept casualties. April 1944 marks the beginning of the Crimean Offensive, an operation that demonstrates Zhukov's ability to coordinate amphibious and ground operations across difficult terrain. German and Romanian forces hold the Crimean Peninsula with approximately 150,000 troops, using the geography to create a fortress that requires either lengthy siege or costly assault. Zhukov coordinates attacks from multiple directions, ground forces attacking across the Perekop Isthmus connecting Crimea to mainland, amphibious landings on Crimea's eastern coast, and naval bombardment supporting both operations. The offensive succeeds in destroying German defensive positions within 35 days, faster than German commanders believed possible. Soviet casualties total approximately 100,000 versus approximately 100,000 German casualties, one of the few operations where casualty exchange approaches parity. The success results partly from effective coordination, but primarily from German forces being surrounded and unable to conduct fighting withdrawal operations that normally increase Soviet casualties. The statistical accounting of operations from August 1943 through May 1944 reveals the scale of what Soviet forces have accomplished. Approximately 278,000 square kilometers of territory liberated, 2,300 cities and towns recaptured, German forces pushed back an average of 600 kilometers. Soviet casualties during this period total approximately 3 million, including 1 million dead. German casualties are approximately 1,500,000. The casualty ratios, approximately 2 Soviet casualties for every German casualty, represent significant improvement from the 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 ratios of 1941 and 42. But the improvement still means that Soviet forces are losing twice as many men as German forces while winning. The mathematics work only because Soviet industrial production and manpower reserves vastly exceed German capabilities. Soviet factories produced 24,000 tanks in 1943 versus German production of 10,700. Soviet aircraft production was 29,900 versus German production of 22,100. Soviet forces can replace casualties and equipment losses at rates that German forces cannot match. May 1944. Zhukov sits in his Moscow office reviewing intelligence reports about German defensive preparations in Belorussia, the last major Soviet territory still under German occupation. The reports indicate that German forces consider the sector relatively stable, expecting Soviet offensive priorities to lie elsewhere. This assessment is exactly wrong, as Zhukov well knows, because he's been planning the Belarusian offensive for months. The operation, codenamed Bagration, will be the largest Soviet offensive of the war, involving approximately 2.3 million troops attacking across a 700-kilometer front. But German intelligence has been successfully deceived through elaborate Maskirovka operations, creating false indicators of Soviet offensive preparations in Ukraine. The deception has worked so well that German reserves are positioned hundreds of kilometers from where they'll actually be needed. Zhukov reviews the Bagration planning documents knowing that the operation will either vindicate his operational concepts or expose their limitations. Success will require coordinating multiple fronts across vast distances, maintaining surprise despite massive troop concentrations, and executing the kind of double envelopment that he first demonstrated at Khalkhin Goal 5 years earlier, but now at scale 50 times larger. The rolling offensive campaign of 1943 and 44 represents Zhukov's maturation as an operational coordinator rather than just a front commander. He's learned to think in terms of theater-wide operations rather than individual battles, to coordinate logistics across multiple fronts, to sequence operations so that each supports the next, and to maintain pressure that prevents enemy forces from ever establishing stable defensive lines. These are the skills of strategic leadership rather than tactical command. But the campaign also reveals the unchanging core of Zhukov's approach: victory through overwhelming force applied with brutal persistence. Soviet forces win not through operational brilliance or tactical innovation, but through material superiority and acceptance of casualties that would cause other armies to pause or retreat. Zhukov's genius, such as it is, lies in organizing and directing this overwhelming force rather than in finding clever ways to achieve victory with limited resources. When he has 10 tanks to the enemy's 5, he wins. When he has equal numbers, as at Rzhev, he fails. This pattern suggests that calling him a military genius requires defining genius as the ability to effectively apply superior resources rather than the ability to achieve victory despite inferior resources. June 1, 1944. Zhukov receives final approval from Stalin to proceed with Operation Bagration, scheduled to begin June 22nd, the third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa. The symbolism is deliberate. Soviet forces will launch their largest offensive exactly 3 years after Germany's invasion, demonstrating how completely the war's dynamics have reversed. Zhukov spends the remaining 3 weeks conducting final coordination meetings with front commanders, reviewing logistics plans, and ensuring that deception operations continue until the last possible moment. He's staked his reputation on Bagration's success. If the operation achieves its objectives, destroying German Army Group Center and liberating Belorussia, he'll be recognized as the architect of Germany's defeat in the East. If it fails, if German forces contain the breakthroughs, or if logistics collapse, or if coordination fails, he'll be blamed for the greatest Soviet operational failure since the summer of 1941. The risk is enormous, but Zhukov has survived this long by taking calculated risks and executing them with ruthless determination. Bagration represents the culmination of everything he's learned about modern warfare. In 3 weeks, approximately 2 million Soviet soldiers will begin an offensive that will either validate Zhukov's methods or expose their fundamental limitations. The peasant's son who became a marshal is about to conduct the largest military operation in history. Success will make him untouchable despite Stalin's paranoia. Failure will probably make him dead. January 18th, 1944. Georgy Zhukov stands at attention in the Kremlin's Georgievsky Hall while Stalin pins the Marshal of the Soviet Union star to his uniform for the second time, this ceremony making the rank official after months of acting in the capacity. The assembled generals and party officials applaud with the calculated enthusiasm that characterizes all Soviet public events. But observers note something unusual. Stalin's speech praising Zhukov is notably brief, approximately 2 minutes compared to the 15-minute speeches Stalin typically delivers at such ceremonies. There's no embrace, no photograph of Stalin and Zhukov standing together despite photographers positioned to capture exactly such an image. Stalin returns to his position on the podium without further interaction. The ceremony concludes abruptly. Zhukov returns to his quarters, understanding that something has shifted in his relationship with Stalin, though the precise nature of the shift remains unclear. Within weeks, the NKVD surveillance reports on Zhukov will increase in volume and specificity, tracking his conversations, monitoring his correspondence, and reporting any statements that might indicate excessive pride or insufficient deference to party leadership. The political problem Zhukov represents for Stalin is straightforward. He's become too successful, too visible, and too necessary. Soviet propaganda has made Zhukov's name synonymous with military victory. Necessary for maintaining morale, but dangerous because it suggests that individuals rather than the party leadership create success. Soldier surveys conducted by NKVD informants and military units show that approximately 78% of respondents credit Zhukov personally for Soviet victories, versus 45% crediting Stalin. These numbers terrify Stalin because they suggest divided loyalty, the possibility that army units might follow Zhukov rather than Stalin if conflict arose. The historical precedent haunts Stalin constantly. Successful generals overthrowing political leaders is a pattern that extends from ancient Rome through Bonaparte's coup d'état. Stalin has already executed most of the Red Army's senior leadership during the Purges precisely to prevent such scenarios, but now he needs Zhukov too much to eliminate him, creating a dilemma that Stalin resolves through systematic efforts to minimize Zhukov's visibility while maximizing his usefulness. March 1944 brings a particularly revealing incident that illuminates Stalin's management of his most successful general. Allied military coordination has improved to the point where Roosevelt and Churchill request direct liaison with Soviet military leadership to coordinate operations as Allied forces prepare to invade France. Eisenhower specifically requests that Zhukov be appointed as Soviet liaison to Allied headquarters, arguing that coordination requires working with commanders who have actual operational authority. Stalin rejects the request immediately, stating that Zhukov is needed for operations in the East and cannot be spared for liaison duties. The rejection isn't about operational necessity. Multiple Soviet generals could coordinate with Western allies competently. The rejection is about preventing Zhukov from developing relationships with Western leaders that might provide him political alternatives to complete dependence on Stalin. Keeping Zhukov isolated, preventing him from building independent power bases, whether domestic or international, is fundamental to Stalin's management of the political threat that Zhukov represents. June 1944 marks another subtle but significant political maneuver. Zhukov appears on the front page of Pravda for the first time in months. A prominent photograph showing him studying maps at a forward command post. The article describes his role in planning upcoming operations and credits him with major victories. For approximately 1 week, Zhukov receives unusual media visibility and public recognition. Then, abruptly, he disappears from Soviet media coverage entirely. Pravda stops mentioning him. Radio broadcasts discussing military operations refer generically to Soviet commanders, without naming Zhukov specifically. The pattern repeats throughout the summer. Periodic visibility followed by complete media blackout. The oscillation isn't random. Stalin is managing Zhukov's public profile carefully, allowing enough recognition to maintain Zhukov's credibility with military personnel while preventing the sustained visibility that might build a personality cult. The technique is sophisticated. Zhukov receives credit for successes, but never consistently enough to become a permanent fixture in public consciousness, independent of party leadership. October 1944 brings perhaps the most significant political decision affecting Zhukov's role: Stalin's reorganization of command responsibilities for the final offensive into Germany. Military logic suggests that Zhukov, as Deputy Supreme Commander and the Soviet Union's most successful general, should command the main thrust toward Berlin along the most direct route through Poland. Instead, Stalin assigns Zhukov to coordinate the First Belarusian Front, a secondary axis of advance, while Marshal Ivan Konev receives command of the First Ukrainian Front, which will advance along the most direct route to Berlin through southern Poland. The decision makes limited military sense. Zhukov has more experience with large-scale operations and better coordination capabilities. But it makes perfect political sense. Stalin is ensuring that no single general receives undivided credit for capturing Berlin. By positioning Zhukov and Konev in competing roles with unclear boundary lines between their fronts, Stalin creates a situation where both generals will compete for glory, while Stalin retains control over which one reaches Berlin first. The competition between Zhukov and Konev becomes overt by late 1944. Both marshals understand that capturing Berlin represents the war's ultimate prize, the achievement that will define their historical legacies and potentially their political futures. Konev, younger and more politically astute than Zhukov, cultivates relationships with party officials and NKVD officers that Zhukov largely ignores. Zhukov relies on professional military reputation and operational competence, assuming that success in battle translates to political security. This assumption is dangerously naive in Stalin's Soviet Union, where political loyalty matters more than professional competence when determining who survives purges. The rivalry intensifies as both marshals begin planning operations for early 1945, each attempting to position their forces to reach Berlin before the other, each lobbying Stavka for additional resources and priority in the offensive timetable. December 19th, 1944 brings Stalin's 65th birthday celebration, an event that provides insight into the dictator's relationship with his senior military commanders. The Kremlin reception includes elaborate toasts, speeches praising Stalin's genius, and carefully choreographed interactions. Zhukov attends and delivers a toast praising Stalin's strategic vision and leadership. The toast is brief, perfunctory, containing none of the elaborate flattery that characterizes other speeches. When Zhukov attempts to elaborate, Stalin interrupts him and calls for the next speaker. Photographs from the event show Zhukov positioned away from Stalin, never appearing in the same frame despite dozens of photographs taken. This exclusion is deliberate. Stalin is ensuring that no photographs exist, showing him in friendly interaction with his most successful general, preventing any visual imagery that might suggest partnership rather than Stalin's sole leadership. Zhukov leaves the reception understanding that his victories have made him simultaneously indispensable and expendable. Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD and Stalin's chief enforcer, plays a crucial role in managing the Zhukov problem throughout 1943 and 44. Beria receives regular intelligence reports on Zhukov's activities, statements, and relationships. These reports are selectively edited to emphasize anything that might be interpreted as excessive ambition or insufficient loyalty. Beria presents these reports to Stalin, with interpretations suggesting that Zhukov's popularity among soldiers represents a potential threat. The reports note that soldiers in certain units have been heard saying they'd follow Zhukov if he ordered action against party leadership. These statements, whether genuine or invented by NKVD provocateurs, create a narrative of Zhukov as potentially disloyal, despite his consistent public deference to Stalin. Beria's goal isn't necessarily Zhukov's execution. It's maintaining Zhukov's political vulnerability so that he remains dependent on Stalin's protection rather than developing independent power. The psychological burden of navigating this political environment while simultaneously commanding military operations across multiple fronts would break most people. Zhukov manages it through compartmentalization and emotional detachment that borders on pathological. He discusses operational matters with professional competence and complete focus, but he never discusses politics, never comments on party leadership except in formulaic praise, and never expresses personal opinions on non-military topics. His staff officers note that Zhukov seems to have no internal life beyond military operations. He doesn't maintain friendships, doesn't engage in the social interactions that characterize normal human relationships, and shows no interest in family beyond perfunctory maintenance of contact. This emotional void, which might be depression in another context, functions as protective coloring in Stalin's Soviet Union. A general with no interest beyond military duty represents minimal political threat because political threats arise from ambitions and relationships that extend beyond narrow professional scope. Zhukov's memoirs, published decades later and heavily censored by Soviet authorities, barely acknowledge the political dynamics of 1943 and 44. The published text presents a sanitized version where Stalin and Zhukov work in professional harmony toward shared victory. Excise sections, which emerged after the Soviet Union's collapse, reveal Zhukov's awareness of the political dangers he faced. One deleted passage describes his conscious decision to avoid media attention and public recognition, despite opportunities for both. Another discusses his awareness that his success made him vulnerable to the same purges that destroyed the 1930s military leadership. These deletions suggest that Zhukov understood his situation clearly. He was simultaneously the indispensable architect of Soviet victory and a potential target for elimination once his military usefulness ended. The peasant's son who survived the purges through political cunning in 1937 now deployed those same survival skills while commanding armies that exceeded Napoleon's Grande Armée in size. January 1945. Zhukov receives orders for the Vistula-Oder offensive, the operation that will carry Soviet forces across Poland to positions 60 kilometers from Berlin. The orders come with unusual constraints, specific instructions about maintaining coordination with Konev's First Ukrainian Front, explicit prohibitions on advancing beyond certain lines without Stavka authorization, and requirements for daily reporting on operational progress. These constraints, unusual for operations where Zhukov typically received broad operational latitude, reflect Stalin's determination to maintain control over the Berlin operation's final phase. Zhukov studies the orders and understands their political subtext. Stalin doesn't trust him to capture Berlin without specific authorization. The lack of trust, despite 2 years of continuous victories, would be insulting if Zhukov allowed himself to feel insulted. Instead, he files the emotional response away in whatever psychological compartment holds such reactions and focuses on operational planning. The war will be over soon. Whether he survives its conclusion remains uncertain. But survival requires executing operations successfully while avoiding any appearance of excessive ambition. The strategy has worked so far. The next 4 months will determine whether it continues working, because the Soviet Union is about to enter Germany itself, and the man who captures Berlin will either become the Soviet Union's greatest hero or its next purge victim. History offers examples of both outcomes. Zhukov intends to navigate between them. Whether intention translates to success depends on variables he cannot entirely control, but control has always been illusory anyway. The peasant's son learned that lesson 70 years ago in a one-room hut where survival depended on forces beyond his influence. The lesson still applies. Some things never change. April the 22nd, 1944. Georgy Zhukov stands before a large terrain model of Belorussia in a Stavka planning room, using a pointer to indicate German defensive positions to Stalin and assembled front commanders. The model, constructed over weeks using reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports, shows every German fortified position, every river crossing, every forest and swamp across 700 kilometers of front. Zhukov has been planning this operation since February, coordinating with 4 front commanders and dozens of specialized units, assembling resources for what will be the largest Soviet offensive operation of the war. Now he must convince Stalin that his plan's counterintuitive aspects represent strategic genius rather than foolish risk. The central argument he's making contradicts Stalin's instincts. Zhukov wants to attack through Belorussia rather than Ukraine, through terrain that includes the Pripyat marshes and dense forests, through territory that conventional military wisdom considers unsuitable for major offensive operations. Stalin repeatedly interrupts, questioning why Soviet forces should attack, where geography favors defenders rather than attacking in Ukraine, where open terrain favors Soviet armor superiority. Zhukov's response to Stalin's skepticism demonstrates strategic thinking that elevates him above most Soviet commanders. He argues that attacking through Belorussia is correct, precisely because German commanders consider it unlikely. German forces are concentrated in Ukraine because German intelligence expects Soviet offensive priorities to follow terrain that favors armor operations. Army Group Center in Belorussia is relatively weaker because German reserves have been shifted south. More importantly, successful breakthrough in Belorussia would cut the most direct route between Germany and Army Group North in the Baltic states, potentially trapping another 1 million German soldiers in a strategic encirclement. The operation's potential payoff exceeds anything achievable in Ukraine. Stalin listens to this analysis, studies the terrain model, asks detailed questions about river crossing operations and forest warfare tactics, then announces his approval. The meeting concludes with Stalin stating that Bagration's success or failure will determine whether the Soviet Union wins the war in 1944 or whether fighting continues into 1945 or beyond. The pressure is explicit. Zhukov will succeed or will be held personally responsible for failure. May through early June brings the largest military deception operation in history to that point. An elaborate maskirovka designed to convince German intelligence that Soviet offensive priorities lie in Ukraine rather than Belorussia. Soviet forces conduct obvious preparations for offensive operations south of the Pripyat marshes, concentrating dummy tanks made of wood and canvas, generating radio traffic simulating major troop concentrations, and conducting reconnaissance activities that German observers are allowed to detect. Simultaneously, the actual buildup for Bagration proceeds under strict camouflage and radio silence. Units moving into Belorussia travel at night, hide under forest cover during day, maintain communication through landlines rather than radio, and are supported by partisan forces who provide security against German reconnaissance. The deception succeeds so completely that German intelligence estimates on June 21st place Soviet strategic reserves approximately 500 kilometers from where they actually are concentrated. German Army Group Center in Belorussia has approximately 1,200,000 troops versus Soviet attacking forces of 2,331,700, a ratio of nearly 2-to-1 favoring Soviet forces. German commanders don't realize they're outnumbered until Soviet artillery opens fire. June 19th and 20th bring the partisan phase of Bagration, an often overlooked aspect that demonstrates sophisticated coordination between regular military forces and irregular partisans. Soviet partisan forces in Belorussia, approximately 145,000 fighters operating behind German lines, receive orders to conduct simultaneous sabotage operations targeting German rail lines. On the night of June 19th to 20th, partisan units execute 10,500 demolitions on rail tracks, bridges, and switching stations across Belorussia, severing German logistics and preventing rapid movement of reserves. The sabotage is timed to begin 48 hours before the main offensive, early enough to disrupt German preparations, but not so early that it provides strategic warning, allowing German forces to concentrate properly. German commanders receive reports of massive partisan activity, but interpret it as normal harassment rather than coordination with an imminent major offensive. This interpretation error cost Germany the ability to respond quickly when Soviet attacks actually begin. June 22, 1944, 5 o'clock in the morning. The sky over Belarusia disappears behind smoke and flame as 24,000 Soviet guns open simultaneous bombardment across the entire 700-kilometer front. The artillery preparation lasts 2 hours and 20 minutes, delivering approximately 1,200,000 shells on German positions, systematically targeting command posts, communication centers, artillery positions, and forward defensive zones. German soldiers, waking to bombardment of unprecedented intensity, huddle in bunkers and trenches while their defensive positions are methodically demolished. The bombardment's sophistication exceeds anything Soviet forces have previously achieved. Rather than random area bombardment, Soviet artillery executes carefully planned fires, using intelligence derived from months of reconnaissance. Each German strongpoint has been identified, surveyed for exact coordinates, and assigned to specific artillery units. The result is concentrated destruction rather than scattered harassment. When Soviet infantry and armor begin advancing at 7:20 in the morning, they encounter German defensive positions that have been reduced to rubble and disorganized survivors rather than coherent defensive networks. The initial breakthrough operations succeed beyond even optimistic Soviet projections. By June 24th, Soviet forces have penetrated German forward defensive zones across multiple sectors, advancing 20 to 30 kilometers in 48 hours. German commanders attempt to organize counterattacks using armored reserves, but the reserves are scattered across wide areas and cannot concentrate quickly due to partisan sabotage of rail lines. Soviet aircraft, achieving air superiority through sheer numerical overwhelming of German fighters, attack German columns attempting to move to threatened sectors. The Luftwaffe, by this point in the war, is a shadow of its former capability, unable to provide effective ground support or air superiority. Soviet Sturmovik ground attack aircraft strafe German positions with relative impunity, a dramatic reversal from 1941, when German air superiority was absolute. By June 25th, German defensive coherence has collapsed across much of the front, with Soviet spearheads operating in areas that were supposedly secure German rear zones 72 hours earlier. June 27th marks the first major encirclement when Soviet forces capture Vitebsk, trapping approximately 5 German divisions in a pocket that they cannot escape. The Vitebsk encirclement demonstrates Zhukov's operational concept: breakthrough on multiple axes converging to encircle German strongpoints rather than attacking those strongpoints directly. Soviet mobile groups bypass Vitebsk itself, racing past the city to meet northeast of it, trapping German forces that Hitler has ordered to hold the city at all costs. The Germans in Vitebsk attempt breakout operations, but Soviet forces have established blocking positions that prevent escape. Over 3 days, Soviet forces systematically destroy the pocket, killing or capturing approximately 40,000 German soldiers. The pattern established at Vitebsk repeats across Belarusia over the next 2 weeks. German forces ordered to hold positions find themselves encircled as Soviet mobile groups operate in their rear areas, then destroyed as Soviet forces reduce the pockets methodically. July 3, 1944 brings the liberation of Minsk, the Belarusian capital that fell to German forces in the war's first week. Soviet tanks enter the city from multiple directions simultaneously, a dramatic symbol of the encirclement that has trapped approximately 100,000 German soldiers east of Minsk in what will become known as the Minsk Pocket. German commanders inside the pocket attempt to organize breakout operations, but they lack fuel for their vehicles, have lost communication with higher headquarters, and are under continuous Soviet artillery bombardment and air attack. Hitler, receiving reports of the developing catastrophe, issues orders forbidding retreat and demanding that encircled forces hold their positions. These orders, which might have made sense if German reserves were available to relieve the pockets, are militarily insane given the actual situation. They doom German soldiers to death or capture without achieving any strategic purpose. Soviet forces, by contrast, are executing operations with clinical precision, maintaining pressure on German forces while systematically reducing encircled pockets without allowing desperation to drive premature attacks that would increase Soviet casualties. The scale of German Army Group Center's destruction over 3 weeks exceeds even Stalingrad's disaster. Between June 22nd and mid-July, German forces in Belorussia lose approximately 450,000 casualties, including 300,000 dead or captured. 28 German divisions are completely destroyed, effectively ceasing to exist as military formations. Soviet forces advanced 600 kilometers in 68 days, liberating all of Belorussia and entering Poland. Soviet casualties during Bagration total approximately 765,000, including 180,000 dead, maintaining the approximately 2-to-1 casualty ratio that characterizes successful Soviet operations. The operation achieves everything Zhukov promised Stalin: Army Group Center's destruction, liberation of Soviet territory, and creation of strategic conditions allowing subsequent offensives into Poland and the Baltic states. German strategic reserves in the east have been consumed attempting to stabilize the Belarusian front, leaving other sectors vulnerable to Soviet offensive operations. August 1st, 1944. Zhukov tours the Minsk pocket where approximately 100,000 German prisoners are being assembled for transport to Soviet camps. The prisoners are hungry, exhausted, and defeated, many wounded and without medical treatment. Zhukov watches them being loaded onto trains with the professional detachment that characterizes his approach to all aspects of warfare. Some Soviet propaganda officers are filming the scene for newsreels that will show Soviet citizens the scale of victory achieved. Zhukov orders the filming stopped, not from humanitarian concern, but because he considers it undignified to celebrate before final victory is achieved. His staff notes that Zhukov shows no particular satisfaction despite commanding the most successful Soviet operation of the war. He treats Bagration's success as confirmation that his operational methods are correct, rather than as cause for emotional celebration. Within days, he'll be reassigned to coordinate other operations, as Stalin continues the pattern of moving Zhukov between crisis points rather than allowing him sustained command of any single front. The strategic impact of Operation Bagration extends far beyond Belarusia's liberation. German military leadership recognizes that Army Group Center's destruction marks the point where Germany loses any possibility of achieving even a negotiated settlement in the East. The Eastern Front has irrevocably turned against Germany. German reserves are exhausted. The industrial capacity to replace losses no longer exists. The psychological shock of Bagration's scale and speed breaks the confidence of German commanders who've spent 3 years believing in German operational superiority. Soviet operational methods, refined through 3 years of catastrophic learning, have finally matured to the point where they can consistently defeat German forces even when Germans hold defensive advantages. Zhukov's operational concepts, brutal and casualty-intensive but effective, have been validated through Bagration's success. Soviet forces can conduct sophisticated multi-front operations with deception, coordination, and exploitation that match or exceed German capabilities demonstrated in 1941. Bagration's historical neglect in Western consciousness, where Operation Overlord and the Normandy invasion received far more attention, despite being smaller in scale and casualties, reflects Cold War politics more than military significance. Western historians emphasizing D-Day serve national narratives about Western Allied contributions to Nazi Germany's defeat. But the mathematical reality is that Bagration killed more German soldiers than all Western Allied operations in 1944 combined. The operation destroyed 28 German divisions, versus the estimated 10 to 12 divisions destroyed in Normandy campaign. Soviet forces in Bagration advanced 600 kilometers versus Western Allied advances of approximately 150 kilometers from Normandy beaches to French borders. The casualty comparisons are equally stark. German losses in Belorussia exceeded 450,000 versus approximately 200,000 in France. These numbers don't diminish D-Day's importance for Western Allied strategy. They simply acknowledge that the decisive military operations destroying Nazi Germany occurred on the Eastern Front and were commanded primarily by Georgy Zhukov. The peasant's son who began his military career in Tsarist cavalry has now commanded the largest military operation in human history, coordinating 4 fronts comprising 2,300,000 soldiers across a front wider than the distance from Paris to Moscow. The operation's success validates everything he's learned since joining the Red Army 26 years earlier. It demonstrates mastery of logistics, deception, coordination, and operational art that few commanders in any era have achieved. It also demonstrates his continued willingness to accept casualty rates that humanitarian-minded observers find appalling. 765,000 Soviet casualties, even while achieving historic victory, represent losses that would be politically unacceptable in democratic societies. But Zhukov operates in a system where casualties are state secrets rather than public scandals, where victory justifies any cost, and where generals who show excessive concern for soldiers' lives are considered weak rather than humane. This moral framework enables operational decisions that achieve strategic objectives through methods that might otherwise be considered unacceptable. Whether the ends justify the means is a question for philosophers and ethicists. For Georgy Zhukov, in August 1944, the only relevant question is whether the operation succeeded. It did. Therefore, the methods were correct. The discussion ends there. Next operation is already being planned. The war continues westward. January 12, 1945, 5 o'clock in the morning. The frozen Polish landscape erupts as Soviet artillery begins the largest bombardment in military history. Georgy Zhukov stands in a forward observation bunker, 60 kilometers east of Warsaw, watching through binoculars as the horizon disappears behind fire and smoke. The Vistula-Oder offensive, designed to carry Soviet forces from central Poland to positions within striking distance of Berlin, begins with 22,000 guns firing simultaneously across a front 400 kilometers wide. The bombardment lasts 25 minutes, concentrated with such intensity that German defensive positions simply cease to exist as coherent structures. Then Soviet infantry and armor advance through the smoke, 2,200,000 soldiers moving west with operational objectives that include advancing 500 kilometers in 3 weeks. The target is not just Warsaw or any specific city. The target is Berlin itself, and Zhukov has been authorized to reach it as quickly as his forces can advance. The race to capture Hitler's capital has begun, though Zhukov doesn't yet know he's racing against his own colleague Marshal Ivan Konev, as much as against German resistance. The Vistula-Oder offensive achieves breakthrough within 48 hours, smashing through German defensive lines with a speed that surprises even Soviet planners. German forces, depleted by 3 years of attrition and reeling from Bagration's destruction of Army Group Center 6 months earlier, cannot establish coherent defensive lines against the Soviet onslaught. By January 17th, Soviet forces have advanced 100 kilometers. By January 19th, Warsaw is liberated 3 years after German forces destroyed the city during the Ghetto Uprising. By February 2nd, Soviet spearheads reach the Oder River, approximately 70 kilometers from Berlin, having covered nearly 500 kilometers in 23 days. The advance represents the fastest sustained operational tempo Soviet forces have achieved during the entire war, averaging over 20 kilometers per day across terrain that includes rivers, cities, and winter conditions. German Army Group Center, reconstituted after Bagration's destruction, has been shattered again. German casualties exceed 150,000. Soviet casualties are approximately 200,000, maintaining the 2-to-1 casualty ratio that characterizes Soviet successful operations. The speed of the advance leaves German commanders unable to organize effective resistance or coherent withdrawal operations. February 2nd, 1945. Zhukov reaches the Oder River with his forward units and confronts a decision that will haunt military historians for decades: whether to immediately assault Berlin while German defenses are still disorganized, or pause to consolidate logistics and prepare properly. The military case for pausing is overwhelming. Soviet forces have outrun their supply lines. Ammunition stocks are depleted. Many tank units report fuel levels below 20%. The bridges across the Oder have been destroyed, requiring extensive engineering work before heavy equipment can cross. German forces, though badly damaged, are beginning to concentrate around Berlin, using forces withdrawn from other sectors. The case for immediate assault rests entirely on momentum, and the possibility that German defensive preparations will be more difficult to overcome if given time to solidify. Zhukov requests permission from Stalin to launch an immediate assault on Berlin using whatever forces have reached the Oder. Stalin, in a conversation that Zhukov later describes as brief and decisive, orders him to halt and prepare properly. The explanation Stalin provides is surprising. Western intelligence has reported that Western Allied forces might attempt to reach Berlin before Soviet forces, and Stalin wants to ensure that Soviet forces take the city decisively rather than racing ahead only to be stopped by logistics failures. February through April 1945 represents a period of massive preparation and growing tension between Zhukov and Konev regarding who will ultimately capture Berlin. Stalin, with characteristic manipulation, has drawn the boundary between their fronts in a way that creates ambiguity about which marshal has priority for the Berlin operation. The boundary line extends west from current positions, but terminates approximately 60 kilometers east of Berlin, rather than continuing to the city itself. This means that whichever front advances faster in the coming offensive will have legitimate claim to attacking Berlin. Konev, commanding 1st Ukrainian Front south of Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front, recognizes the opportunity and begins planning operations designed to angle northwest toward Berlin rather than advancing directly west. Zhukov, recognizing Konev's intentions, protests to Stavka that the boundaries should be clarified. Stalin refuses, stating that operational conditions will determine appropriate boundaries. The message is clear. Stalin is creating a competitive situation where both marshals will push their forces to maximum effort, attempting to be first into Berlin. The competition between Zhukov and Konev transforms military planning into a dysfunctional race that prioritizes speed over sensible operational planning. Both marshals stockpile resources beyond what their actual operational needs require, hoarding ammunition and fuel that might be needed to support rapid advances toward Berlin. Both plan operations with aggressive timetables that accept high casualties to maintain tempo. Both position their best units on approaches that lead toward Berlin rather than distributing forces according to enemy dispositions. Stalin encourages this competition through carefully phrased communications that suggest he's evaluating which marshal deserves the honor of capturing Hitler's capital. The result is an atmosphere where professional military judgment becomes subordinated to personal ambition and political competition. Officers on both front staffs understand that their marshal's reputation, and potentially their own careers, depend on reaching Berlin before the rival front. This creates incentives for risk-taking and corner-cutting that would be considered professionally irresponsible in less politicized command environments. April 16, 1945, 5 o'clock in the morning. The Berlin offensive begins with a bombardment that exceeds even the Vistula-Oder offensive's intensity. Zhukov has concentrated 41,600 guns and mortars on 1st Belarusian Front sector, achieving densities of over 200 guns per kilometer in breakthrough sectors. The bombardment lasts 30 minutes, then Soviet infantry and armor advance accompanied by an innovation that will prove both dramatic and militarily questionable. 143 searchlights positioned to blind German defenders with intense light. Zhukov has ordered the searchlights activated as Soviet forces advance, theoretically creating confusion among German defenders while illuminating targets for Soviet attackers. The reality proves more complicated. The searchlights illuminate smoke and dust from the bombardment, creating a wall of reflected light that blinds Soviet attackers as much as German defenders. The innovation, which looked brilliant in planning, proves nearly useless in execution. Soviet forces advance regardless, but the searchlights contribute nothing except providing a dramatic visual for the operation's beginning. The Berlin offensive's initial phase encounters unexpected difficulties that reveal the problems with Zhukov's aggressive planning. The main attack axis approaches Berlin through the Silo Heights. a line of hills approximately 15 kilometers east of Berlin that provides German defenders with commanding terrain and clear fields of fire. German forces, commanded by General Gotthard Heinrizi, who understands defensive warfare better than most German officers, have positioned their main defensive line on the reverse slope of the heights, protecting it from direct Soviet artillery fire while maintaining defensive positions that can engage Soviet attackers advancing uphill. Zhukov's plan assumes that overwhelming artillery will suppress German defenses sufficiently to allow rapid breakthrough. The assumption proves wrong. German defenders, though heavily outnumbered and outgunned, have fortified positions that Soviet artillery cannot destroy without direct assault. Soviet forces attacking the Silo Heights encounter sustained defensive fire from positions they thought would be destroyed. The result is a grinding three-day battle that produces 33,000 Soviet casualties for an advance of 17 kilometers. April 20th, Hitler's birthday, Soviet artillery begins bombarding Berlin proper, shells landing in the city center for the first time. Zhukov's forces have finally broken through the Silo Heights and are approaching Berlin's eastern suburbs. But Konev's forces, attacking from the south through less heavily defended terrain, have made comparable progress and are also approaching Berlin. Stalin, watching both offensives from Moscow, makes the decision that resolves the competition. He authorizes both fronts to attack Berlin from their respective directions, effectively ending the ambiguity about which marshal would capture the city. The decision reflects Stalin's recognition that Berlin's capture is more important than determining which marshal receives primary credit. Zhukov receives orders to assault from the east, while Konev attacks from the south. Both marshals will share the victory, though Zhukov's First Belarusian Front will have responsibility for the city center, where the Reichstag and Hitler's bunker are located. April 25th, Soviet forces from Zhukov's and Konev's fronts meet west of Berlin, completing the encirclement of the city. Approximately 300,000 German soldiers are trapped inside Berlin with minimal supplies and no prospect of relief. Hitler, in his underground bunker, issues orders for non-existent armies to relieve the city and continues planning counteroffensives that exist only in his increasingly detached imagination. The German defense of Berlin, though hopeless, is nevertheless fierce. German soldiers fight building by building, creating casualties that mount with each city block. Soviet forces employ tactics learned in Stalingrad, using flamethrowers to clear buildings, artillery fired at point-blank range to demolish defensive positions, and infantry assault groups to systematically clear resistance. The urban combat is extraordinarily costly. Soviet forces lose approximately 350 soldiers for each kilometer advanced through Berlin's streets. Zhukov watches casualty reports accumulate and understands that the Berlin operation, despite being the war's symbolic culmination, is producing losses that exceed military necessity. The city could be surrounded and starved into submission with far fewer casualties. But Stalin wants Berlin captured immediately, and the competition with Konev creates pressure to advance rapidly, regardless of costs. April 30th, 1945. Approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. Soviet soldiers from the 150th Rifle Division reach the Reichstag and begin the assault that will produce some of the war's most iconic images. The Reichstag, the German parliament building that symbolizes German state authority, has been converted into a fortress with approximately 5,000 German defenders. Soviet forces attack it with the desperation of soldiers who understand that capturing this building will symbolically end the war in Europe. The battle for the Reichstag lasts approximately 36 hours and costs 2,500 Soviet casualties. German defenders fight room by room, floor by floor, until Soviet soldiers finally reach the roof and plant the Soviet flag on the 2nd of May. The photograph of the flag being raised, later revealed to be a staged recreation of earlier flag raisings, becomes one of history's most recognizable images. Zhukov, monitoring reports from his command post, notes the Reichstag's capture with professional satisfaction, but without the emotional response that propaganda will later attribute to the moment. It's a military objective secured. The war continues until all German forces surrender. May 2nd, 1945, 6 o'clock in the morning. General Helmuth Weidling, commander of Berlin's defense, surrenders to Zhukov personally at a forward command post in the city's eastern suburbs. The ceremony is distinctly anticlimactic, a German general signing surrender documents in a damaged building, while Soviet staff officers process paperwork. Zhukov asks Weidling about Hitler's fate. Weidling reports that Hitler committed suicide 2 days earlier, and that his body was burned. Zhukov receives this information without visible reaction, orders Weidling to be transported to Moscow for interrogation, and returns to reviewing operational plans for continuing Soviet advances against German forces still fighting in Czechoslovakia and Austria. The surrender of Berlin, the objective that dominated Soviet strategic planning for months, and Zhukov's personal focus since February, concludes with bureaucratic routine rather than dramatic triumph. Western expectations of victorious generals savoring their achievements don't account for Soviet operational culture, where victory simply means the next operation can proceed. The Berlin operation's final statistics reveal both its military significance and its terrible human costs. Soviet forces lost 78,291 dead, 274,184 wounded, and approximately 2,500 tanks and aircraft. German casualties were approximately 450,000 military, plus 125,000 civilian deaths. The casualty figures for capturing a city that was already surrounded and could not affect the war's outcome raise profound questions about whether the operation's execution served military necessity or political theater. Zhukov could have surrounded Berlin, cut off supplies, and forced surrender through starvation within weeks while minimizing casualties. Instead, he ordered immediate assault operations that turned Berlin into an urban battlefield, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. The decision reflected multiple factors: Stalin's orders for immediate capture, competition with Konev, creating pressure for rapid advance, and Zhukov's consistent operational philosophy that maintaining momentum justifies accepting high casualties. Whether these justifications excuse the human costs depends entirely on your ethical framework. The race to Berlin reveals Zhukov at both his most effective and his most morally questionable. He coordinated 2 massive offensives covering over 500 kilometers in 4 months, maintaining operational tempo that German forces could not counter, achieving the war's ultimate objective of capturing Hitler's capital. These accomplishments demonstrate operational competence that few commanders in history have matched. Simultaneously, he accepted casualty rates that were militarily unnecessary, driven by political competition and Stalin's demand for rapid victory. The Silo Heights battle particularly demonstrates operational stubbornness. When initial attacks encountered stronger resistance than anticipated, Zhukov escalated force rather than adjusting tactics, accepting 33,000 casualties for advances that careful preparation might have achieved at half the cost. This pattern, visible throughout his career, reflects the fundamental characteristic that defines Zhukov's approach to command. He solves military problems through overwhelming application of force rather than through tactical innovation or economy of force. When force is available in overwhelming quantities, the approach works. The question that history cannot definitively answer is whether a different approach might have worked better. May 8, 1945, 11:59 at night. Zhukov sits at a table in Berlin's Karlshorst district, watching German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel sign the final instrument of unconditional surrender, ending World War II in Europe. The ceremony, conducted according to previously agreed procedures with Western allies, involves multiple signings and official protocols. Zhukov signs as representative of Soviet Supreme Command. The process takes approximately 20 minutes. When the last signature is affixed and the documents are collected, someone suggests a toast to victory. Zhukov drinks vodka, stands, and exits the building without making a speech or participating in celebrations. His staff follows, uncertain whether his behavior reflects exhaustion, emotional restraint, or recognition that victory brings new dangers for a general who's become too successful. The peasant's son who saved Moscow designed Stalingrad's encirclement, planned Kursk's defense, commanded Bagration, and captured Berlin, has achieved everything a Soviet marshal could achieve militarily. Whether he survives his own success politically remains to be seen, because the war against Germany is over, but Stalin's paranoia never sleeps. And history provides ample examples of tyrants eliminating generals who've become dangerously popular. Zhukov walks out of the surrender ceremony knowing that the next battle for his own survival is about to begin. And this battle won't be fought with tanks and artillery. It will be fought with rumors, accusations, and political machinations in Moscow. The skills that won military victories provide no protection against Stalin's suspicion. The next 4 years will determine whether the conqueror of Berlin suffers the same fate as so many other successful Soviet generals: disgrace, exile, and potentially execution. The war is over. The danger has just begun. May 9th, 1945, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Georgy Zhukov rides a white stallion through Berlin's Brandenburg Gate at the head of a victory parade showcasing Soviet military power. The symbolism is overwhelming. A Russian general on horseback passing through the monument that symbolizes Prussian military tradition. Soviet tanks and soldiers following him through a city that will never again threaten Russia. Western journalists photograph the scene extensively, and within days the images appear in newspapers worldwide with captions identifying Zhukov as the man who defeated Hitler. Stalin, watching newsreel footage of the parade in Moscow, observes Zhukov's prominent role with the cold calculation that characterizes his approach to all political questions. The dictator notes how Zhukov sits naturally on the horse, how soldiers salute him with evident enthusiasm, how the entire spectacle creates the impression of a conquering hero receiving his due. These observations, seemingly trivial, activate Stalin's deep paranoia about successful generals potentially threatening his authority. Within weeks, the NKVD will receive instructions to intensify surveillance on Zhukov and begin compiling materials for potential charges. June 5th, 1945, brings an event that retrospectively appears as the apex of Zhukov's career and simultaneously the beginning of his fall. General Dwight Eisenhower visits Berlin and meets with Zhukov to coordinate ongoing occupation matters. The meeting, photographed extensively by Western and Soviet journalists, shows Eisenhower and Zhukov standing together, Eisenhower saluting Zhukov and presenting him with America's Legion of Merit decoration. The photographs create the visual impression of equal partnership between the supreme commanders who defeated Germany. Western newspapers describe Zhukov as the greatest general of World War II and speculate about his role in post-war Soviet leadership. These accolades, which would be career-enhancing in most countries, are politically toxic in Stalin's Soviet Union. The NKVD compiles all Western press coverage mentioning Zhukov and presents it to Stalin, with annotations emphasizing how foreign media portrays Zhukov as a potential alternative power center to Stalin himself. Whether Stalin would have moved against Zhukov, regardless of Western praise, is unknowable. But the Western media attention certainly accelerates the timeline. The fabricated charges against Zhukov begin accumulating in late summer 1945, a collection of accusations that reveal more about Stalin's political methods than about Zhukov's actual conduct. NKVD reports claim that Zhukov has appropriated German property, specifically furniture, artwork, and luxury goods that should have been transferred to the Soviet state. The accusations are technically accurate. Like virtually every Soviet officer in Germany, Zhukov collected war trophies and sent them home. This behavior, though technically illegal, was universal practice that command authorities tacitly permitted, as informal compensation for officers who'd spent years in combat. But universal practice becomes grounds for charges when political authorities decide someone needs to be discredited. Additional accusations claim that Zhukov is building a cult of personality, accepting too much credit for victories that properly belong to party leadership and Soviet socialist system. These charges are evidenced by Western press coverage and by soldiers' statements, collected through NKVD informants, crediting Zhukov personally for victories. March 1946 marks Zhukov's first interrogation regarding the accumulated charges. He's summoned to Moscow and confronted in Stalin's office with evidence of his supposed crimes. The evidence includes inventories of property he sent home from Germany, copies of Western newspaper articles praising him, and reports from NKVD informants claiming he made statements criticizing party leadership. Zhukov, understanding that denial is pointless when accusations are fabricated, acknowledges taking war trophies and accepting Western decorations, but denies making statements criticizing Stalin or party leadership. Stalin, in a performance that combines accusation with paternal disappointment, states that Zhukov's achievements have made him arrogant, that arrogance has led to violations of discipline and socialist principles, that such violations cannot be tolerated regardless of past achievements. The meeting concludes with Stalin announcing that Zhukov is being relieved as commander of Soviet occupation forces in Germany and reassigned to command Odessa military district. The reassignment, from the Soviet Union's most visible position to a provincial backwater, constitutes a clear demotion understood by all Soviet officers as disgrace. June 1946 brings Zhukov's arrival in Odessa, beginning an exile that will last nearly 7 years. Odessa Military District is a minor command far from Moscow, far from centers of political power, and deliberately chosen to minimize Zhukov's visibility and influence. The district headquarters staff includes multiple NKVD informants whose primary function is monitoring Zhukov's activities and statements. His phones are tapped, his mail is read, his visitors are documented. The surveillance is sufficiently obvious that Zhukov understands he's not just being monitored, but that he's meant to know he's being monitored, creating psychological pressure through awareness of constant observation. His daughters, interviewed decades later, describe their father during this period as withdrawn, silent, and perpetually tense. He stops discussing military matters entirely except when required by official duties. He avoids social interactions beyond minimum necessary for professional functioning. The transformation from celebrated marshal to isolated figure under surveillance takes place over months as Zhukov adjusts his behavior to survive what might be prelude to arrest and execution. 1947 through 1952 bring continued exile with periodic relocations designed to prevent Zhukov from developing any local power base. In 1948, he's transferred from Odessa to command Ural's military district, even more remote from Moscow. The transfer occurs without explanation, but is understood by all observers as continued punishment. During these years, Soviet public discourse on World War II systematically minimizes Zhukov's role or omits him entirely. History textbooks discussing the war mention him briefly, if at all. Victory monuments erected in Moscow and other cities credit Stalin's leadership and Soviet people's heroism without mentioning specific commanders. The 1950 Victory Monument in Moscow features engravings of major battles but no names of generals. Zhukov, the man who commanded most of those battles, has been erased from official history while still alive, a ghostly presence remembered by veterans but absent from state narrative of the war he largely won. The question of why Stalin didn't execute Zhukov, given that execution was Stalin's standard response to perceived threats, has occupied historians for decades. Several factors probably combined to save Zhukov's life. First, unlike many Purge victims, Zhukov had genuine international reputation that made his disappearance politically costly. Western governments, particularly the United States, knew Zhukov personally through wartime coordination and would notice his execution. Second, the Red Army's officer corps, though politically cowed, retained enormous respect for Zhukov, and his execution might create dangerous resentment. Third, Stalin may have calculated that a living, disgraced Zhukov served his purposes better than a martyred dead one. Exile demonstrated that no achievement guaranteed protection from Stalin's wrath, a lesson more useful than another corpse. Fourth, and most speculatively, some evidence suggests Stalin retained grudging respect for Zhukov's military competence and kept him alive as potential resource if war with the West materialized. Whatever the reasons, Zhukov survived while maintaining the careful political performance that survival required, accepting disgrace without complaint, never criticizing Stalin publicly, and remaining available should Stalin decide his services were needed. The psychological burden of these years can only be imagined. Zhukov went from commanding millions of soldiers in history's largest military operations to commanding provincial military districts, where his primary accomplishment was avoiding saying anything that NKVD informants could report as disloyal. He lived with knowledge that, at any moment, a midnight knock could signal NKVD arrest and the journey to Lubyanka prison, from which few returned. His family lived under the same threat, understanding that Zhukov's disgrace extended to them, and that any misstep could trigger consequences for everyone. The isolation was profound. Old colleagues avoided him to prevent guilt by association. New subordinates were often NKVD plants monitoring him, and genuine friendship was impossible in an environment of universal suspicion. That he didn't break under this pressure, didn't commit suicide or become psychologically incapacitated, speaks to extraordinary psychological resilience, or perhaps to emotional detachment, so complete that external circumstances couldn't penetrate to any vulnerable core. March 5th, 1953, 9:50 in the evening. Joseph Stalin suffers a stroke at his dacha and collapses. He will die 4 days later without regaining consciousness, ending the reign that defined Soviet history for 3 decades. News of Stalin's stroke reaches Zhukov in the Urals, where he waits to see whether Stalin's death brings his own reprieve or whether Stalin's successors will complete the purge that Stalin initiated but never concluded. The days between Stalin's stroke and death are tense throughout Soviet leadership, as various factions position themselves for succession struggles. Zhukov, though officially marginalized, represents a potential asset for any faction seeking military support. The question is whether any faction will risk rehabilitating a figure as prominent and potentially dangerous as Zhukov. The answer arrives within days of Stalin's death. Zhukov receives orders to return to Moscow immediately. March 6th, 1953, the day after Stalin's death. Zhukov arrives in Moscow to find a power struggle developing between various Stalin successors, particularly between Nikita Khrushchev and Lavrenti Beria. Beria, the NKVD chief who orchestrated surveillance on Zhukov for years, is attempting to consolidate power by controlling security apparatus. Khrushchev, the Communist Party secretary, needs support to counter Beria's security forces. The military represents the only institution capable of countering the NKVD if leadership conflict turns violent. Khrushchev, with other party leaders, makes a calculated decision: rehabilitate Zhukov, appoint him deputy defense minister, and use his prestige and command authority to neutralize Beria's threat. Zhukov receives the appointment March 6th, understanding immediately that he's being used as a political tool, but accepting the arrangement because it ends his exile and restores some portion of his authority. The peasant son who learned political survival during the Purges recognizes that being useful to new leadership provides protection that principled resistance could never achieve. June 1953 brings the final confrontation with Beria that demonstrates Zhukov's continued willingness to execute ruthless actions when political survival requires it. Khrushchev and other party leaders have decided that Beria must be arrested and eliminated before he consolidates power sufficient to threaten them. But Beria commands the NKVD, making arrest extraordinarily dangerous if NKVD forces intervene. Khrushchev asks Zhukov to personally lead the operation arresting Beria, using military units loyal to Zhukov, rather than trusting security forces that might be loyal to Beria. On June 26th, during a presidium meeting in the Kremlin, Zhukov leads a group of military officers into the room, arrests Beria at gunpoint, and transports him to a military prison where he'll be held until trial and execution. The operation succeeds because Beria's security forces, lacking leadership, don't intervene. Zhukov has essentially conducted a coup within the Soviet leadership structure, removing the second most powerful figure in the government through military action. The service earns him Khrushchev's gratitude and temporary political protection. It also demonstrates that exile hasn't softened Zhukov's ruthlessness. When action is required, he executes it without hesitation or apparent moral qualm. The years immediately following Stalin's death bring partial rehabilitation, as Khrushchev uses Zhukov to consolidate power while simultaneously ensuring Zhukov doesn't become too powerful himself. Zhukov receives promotion to defense minister in 1955, making him the Soviet Union's senior military figure. But the position comes with constraints. He's not a full presidium member, limiting his political authority, and Khrushchev maintains parallel command structures through party channels that prevent Zhukov from achieving independent military power base. Zhukov navigates this environment with the political skills developed over decades, supporting Khrushchev's initiatives while avoiding any appearance of excessive ambition. February 1956 brings Khrushchev's secret speech at the 20th Party Congress, where Khrushchev denounces Stalin's crimes and begins de-Stalinization. The speech partially rehabilitates Zhukov, acknowledging his military achievements while criticizing Stalin's interference in military operations. But Khrushchev is careful to credit Soviet armed forces and Soviet people more than individual commanders, maintaining the party's priority over military leadership even while acknowledging military competence. October 1957 brings Zhukov's final political defeat, demonstrating that even Khrushchev's gratitude has limits. Zhukov, emboldened by his restored position, begins advocating for reducing party political commissars' role in military affairs, arguing that professional military command should be free from political interference. The argument, militarily sensible, is politically suicidal because it challenges the party's control over the military, the fundamental principle maintaining Communist Party authority. Khrushchev, having consolidated power sufficiently that he no longer needs Zhukov's support against rivals, relieves Zhukov as defense minister in October 1957 while Zhukov is visiting Yugoslavia. The relief is accompanied by Pravda articles accusing Zhukov of attempting to remove the military from party control, of building another personality cult, and of various other sins against Soviet political principles. The accusations are similar to those Stalin used in 1946, demonstrating that Soviet political culture's essentials haven't changed despite Stalin's death. Zhukov is forced into retirement at age 61, removed from all official positions, and once again excluded from public life. This time, at least, he's not exiled to provincial commands. He's simply forgotten, a living ghost in a Moscow apartment. The final indignity comes in 1969 when Zhukov publishes his memoirs, Reminiscences and Reflections, only to watch Soviet censors gut the manuscript of anything criticizing party leadership or acknowledging the true costs of victory. The published version spans over 600 pages, but devotes only 3 pages to Rahov, where over 1 million Soviet soldiers died in operations he commanded. The book mentions Stalin hundreds of times, always respectfully, never acknowledging the dictator's catastrophic mistakes that Zhukov witnessed personally. Casualty figures are systematically minimized or omitted entirely. The book transforms history into propaganda, creating a sanitized version of events that serves Soviet political narratives rather than historical truth. Zhukov fights the censorship as much as he can, but ultimately accepts it because publishing even a censored version is better than being erased entirely from the history he helped create. The compromise, characteristic of his entire career, prioritizes survival and partial legacy over principled resistance that would achieve nothing except his own further marginalization. June 18, 1974. Georgy Zhukov dies of a heart attack at age 77 in his Moscow apartment. The state funeral is modest by Soviet standards. He receives military honors and burial at the Kremlin Wall, but the ceremony is smaller and less elaborate than those for political figures of equivalent historical importance. His obituaries credit his military achievements, but emphasize party leadership and Soviet system's role in victory. Within months, he begins fading from Soviet public consciousness, remembered by veterans but absent from the historical narrative that dominates official discourse. The irony is complete. The man who commanded the Red Army through its greatest victories, who captured Berlin and signed Germany's surrender, who achieved military accomplishments that few commanders in history have matched, dies in relative obscurity. His legacy managed and manipulated by the same political system he served his entire adult life. The peasant's son rose higher than anyone from his background should have reached in Tsarist or Soviet Russia, but the rise cost everything except life itself. Whether the price was worth paying is a question Zhukov never publicly answered. Perhaps he didn't know the answer himself. Or perhaps the question was meaningless to a man who learned in childhood that survival was the only achievement that mattered. He survived. That counted for something. Maybe everything. Maybe nothing at all.